Hello, night listener, and welcome to Little Nightmare. I'm Emma, and tonight I'll be keeping you company to help you fall asleep. But before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and leave a comment telling me where you're listening from. Story 1. The first thing he noticed was the dust. It wasn't the passive dust of neglect, the soft gray blanket that settles on abandoned things. This dust was a fine silver gold powder, stirred into languid spirals by a single repeating motion. A hand, pale and long-fingered, would rise from the arm of the threadbare velvet chair, hover for a moment in the thick air like a strange bird considering flight, and then descend to trace the same path on the same worn patch of fabric. Up, hover, down. Up, hover, down. The rhythm was metronomic, a silent clock ticking away seconds in a room where time had lost all meaning. This was Josiah's new ritual, his own private liturgy of stagnation. He would sit for hours in the half-light of the late afternoon, the colossal, brooding silence of the old house pressing in on him, and he would watch the dust dance. He was a man who had spent decades orchestrating chaos, whose life had been a screaming crescendo of amplifiers, roaring crowds, and the sweet, destructive thunder of his own demons. Now, in his 50s, the noise had faded to a tinnitus ring in his ears, and the only movement left was the hypnotic, endless tracing of a finger on a chair. He had bought the chair and the house that contained it on a whim born of a particular kind of jadedness. After the last tour collapsed and the band dissolved into acrimony and lawsuits, he had found himself adrift in a Lowe's Angels that no longer knew his name. His fascination had always tilted toward the macabre, the gothic, the beautifully decayed. He collected taxidermied ravens and Victorian mourning jewelry. He read grimoires and accounts of exorcisms, not as superstition, but as a more interesting kind of history. So, when the real estate listing for Blackfield House appeared on his screen, a sepia-toned photograph of a Queen Anne monstrosity slumped on a cliff above the violent Oregon coast, it felt less like a purchase and more like a summoning. The chair had been the centerpiece of the musty drawing room, the only piece of furniture not shrouded in white sheets. The auctioneer, a nervous man with a sweating brow, had called it a conversation piece, but had been reluctant to say more. Josiah saw the way the man's eyes skipped away from it. He saw the deep, almost black patina of the old velvet, the claw-footed legs of some dark, unnamable wood, and the high, narrow back that seemed designed to isolate its occupant from the world. He had to have it. It spoke to him of old sorrows, of seated vigils, and long, quiet desperation. It cost him a fortune, and he felt it was worth every penny. Lauren, who had followed him from the sun-bleached ruins of their old life, out of a loyalty that baffled even her, hated the chair from the moment she saw it. "It's not a chair, Josiah," she said, her voice a low thrum of anxiety in the vast, echoing foyer. "It's a throne for some miserable god." She was a painter, her hands usually stained with ochre and ultramarine, but here they were always clean, always clasped tightly together, as if for protection. The house had leached the color from her, too. Josiah just smiled, a thin, knowing expression that had once been charismatic and was now merely weary. "Exactly," he said. "The first omen was not a sound, but a smell. It came a week after they moved in, a wet, cold night when the Pacific winds hurled themselves against the house with the fury of the damned. Lauren was trying to light a fire in the great stone fireplace, her hands shaking. Josiah was in his chair, of course, a book of M.R. James stories open, but unread on his lap. The smell arrived suddenly, cutting through the scent of wood smoke and damp wool. It was the smell of salt and brine, not the fresh salt of the sea, but the stale, suffocating salt of a body long submerged in deep water. It was the smell of rotten kelp and things crusted on pilings deep below the tide. "Do you smell that?" Lauren asked, her voice small. Josiah inhaled deeply, a connoisseur of the unpleasant. "The sea," he said. "No," she insisted. "It is not the sea. It is like low tide, inside the house." He dismissed her with a wave of his hand, the same hand that would later trace the pattern on the chair. But the smell lingered for an hour, clinging to the curtains and the rugs, a ghost of the deep. The motions began soon after. Josiah would wake in the dead hours of the night, convinced he had heard the slow, deliberate creak of the floorboards in the drawing room. He would lie still, listening, and the sound would come again, a patient footfall moving from the French doors to the center of the room, and then stopping. He told himself it was the house settling, the ancient bones of the structure groaning under the assault of the wind. But the footsteps had a rhythm, a purpose. They were not random. He started spending more time in the chair, not just in the afternoons, but late into the night. He told Lauren he was composing, that the silence and the atmosphere were inspiring. But the notebook on his knee remained empty. He was waiting. He was listening. The finger tracing began as a nervous habit, a fidget, but it quickly solidified into the ritual. Up, hover, down. It was a way to mark time, to ground himself in the palpable world as the impalpable one drew closer. One evening, he saw it. He was staring into the dark depths of the cold fireplace, the tracing motion on autopilot, when a shift in the light made him look up. A man was standing by the window. He was not transparent, not some shimmering ectoplasm, but solid and starkly real. He was dressed in the heavy, dark wool of a 19th century fisherman. His boots were caked with dried mud. Water dripped from his sou'wester and from the ends of his thick beard, pattering softly onto the floorboards. But his face was the worst part. It was not angry, nor sad, nor menacing. It was empty. The eyes were like chips of wet slate, devoid of any light, any thought, any memory of what it was to be human. They were fixed on Josiah. Josiah did not scream. A coldness seized him, a paralysis that was more awe than fear. This was it, the real thing, the authentic article of death. He held the thing's gaze, his own finger frozen mid-trace above the velvet. The man stood there for a full minute, water pooling around his feet, and then he simply was not there. The space by the window was empty. Only the only smell remained. When he finally told Lauren, her face crumpled. "We have to leave, Josiah. Please, this isn't a game." "Leave," he said, a strange excitement bubbling beneath his calm exterior. "This is what we came for. This is everything. It is not everything. It is a curse. Can you feel it? It is pressing down on us. It is in the air." She gestured wildly around the room. "It is in that damn chair." He looked at the chair. It seemed to pulse with a dark energy, a focal point. He knew she was right, but his obsession was a stronger force than his reason. He was a collector, and he had finally acquired the ultimate piece. The hauntings accumulated, each one a darker brushstroke on the canvas of their lives. The footsteps grew louder, more frequent. Objects began to move. A silver locket that had belonged to Josiah S. mother, a woman who had drowned herself in a lake when he was a boy, was found on the seat of the chair one morning, though it had been locked in a trunk in the attic. The smell of stagnant water became a permanent fixture, clinging to their clothes, their hair. Lauren started sleeping with the lights on, her once bold eyes now shadowed and perpetually startled. Josiah, meanwhile, dove into research. He spent days in the local historical society, digging through brittle, water-stained records. He learned that Blackfield House had been built by a ship-S captain, Alistair Gough, in 1880. Gough had lost his entire family, his wife, and 2 young daughters, when the schooner carrying them from San Francisco sank in a storm just miles from shore. Their bodies were never recovered. Gough had become a recluse, living alone in the house he had built for his family, staring out to sea until his own death from a sudden, unexplained illness in 1892. The house had a string of unhappy owners after that, each tenure ending in tragedy or flight. He found a photograph of Alistair Gough. It was a formal portrait, the captain seated stiffly, his face a mask of stern Victorian propriety. But Josiah S. blood ran cold. The chair Gough was sitting in was unmistakable. It was the velvet chair, and the eyes, even in the faded sepia, held the same profound emptiness he had seen in the apparition by the window. The revelation did not come as a shock, but as a grim confirmation. He was not being haunted by a random spirit. He was being haunted by the previous owner of the chair, a man bound to it by a grief so vast it had seeped into the wood and the fabric, a sorrow that had become a physical presence. Josiah, with his morbid fascination, had been the perfect vessel for it to return. He had invited it in. The violence began subtly. Lauren S. paintings, landscapes that were her last hold on sanity, were found slashed, the canvases torn as if by sharp, furious claws. Then, one night, Josiah woke to the sound of her screaming. He found her in the drawing room, standing rigid, her face white with terror. She pointed a trembling finger at the chair. Deep, fresh scratches ran down its front, as if made by desperate fingernails. And on the seat was a single, damp, perfect footprint, small enough to be a child S. "It is not just him," she whispered, her voice cracking. "He's looking for them, and he thinks we have them." The next day, Josiah received a letter. The handwriting was spidery and unfamiliar. It was from a woman claiming to be his cousin, a relation he had never met, from a branch of the family his mother had severed all ties with. She wrote that she had heard he was living in Blackfield House and felt compelled to contact him. There was a family secret, she wrote, one that involved his mother and the circumstances of her death. She asked if she could visit. Her name was Alina, and she arrived 2 days later, a small, bird-like woman with his mother's eyes. She sat nervously on the edge of the sofa, refusing to even look at the velvet chair. Over tea that grew cold, she told him a story his mother had sworn her to secrecy about. Their family, it turned out, had not always been landlocked. Generations back, they had been sailors, working the treacherous waters of the Pacific Northwest. And one of their ancestors, a man named Silas, had been first mate on a schooner called the Sea Bride. The Sea Bride had sunk in a storm in 1881, with the loss of all hands and passengers. But that's not the whole story, Alina said, her voice barely a whisper. Silas survived. He was found clinging to wreckage. He said the ship went down fast, but that Captain Go had managed to get his wife and daughters into a lifeboat. Silas said he saw the lifeboat clear the ship, and then he said our great-great-grandfather, in a panic, cut the line to the last lifeboat, the one he was in, to save himself. He set himself adrift and watched as Go's family, in their flimsy boat, were swallowed by the waves. The room was silent, except for the relentless ticking of a clock that had not worked in weeks. Josiah felt the world tilt. The haunting was not random. The ghost was not just a sad relic. It was a creditor. The sin of the ancestor had been passed down, a dormant poison in the bloodline, and Josiah, with his attraction to darkness, had finally activated it. He had bought the very object that symbolized Go's loss, and the ghost had come to collect a debt that was over a century old. That night, the climax arrived. A storm worse than any they had seen lashed the house. The windows rattled in their frames, and the wind screamed like a chorus of the drowned. The lights flickered and died, plunging the house into a darkness that was absolute and hungry. Josiah knew it was time. He walked into the drawing room, carrying a single candle. The flame guttered wildly, casting monstrous, leaping shadows. The room was freezing cold, and the smell of the deep ocean was so thick it was difficult to breathe. Lauren and Alina huddled together in the doorway, too terrified to enter. The velvet chair was waiting, and in it sat Alistair Go. He was more substantial than before, his form seeming to draw the very light from the room. Water streamed from his clothes, forming a black pool on the floor. This time, his face was not empty. It was etched with a grief so ancient, and so sharp it was like a physical blow. And in his arms, he cradled two small, indistinct forms, wrapped in sodden shawls. Josiah stood before him. He did not speak. He simply knelt on the wet floorboards, the cold seeping through his jeans. He looked up at the specter of the captain, and in that look, he offered no excuse, no plea. He offered only acknowledgement. He bowed his head, a gesture of acceptance for the crime of his blood. The ghost leaned forward. The air crackled with a silent energy. It did not reach for Josiah. Instead, it extended a dripping hand and pointed a finger, not at Josiah, but at the space on the floor beside him. And then it spoke. Its voice was not a sound, but a pressure inside their skulls, the roar of a hurricane heard from the ocean floor, the groan of a sinking ship's timbers. It was a single word, filled with an anguish that spanned centuries. Mind. The candle flame snapped out. In the absolute darkness, there was a sound of rushing water, a great final sigh, and then nothing. When the power came back on hours later, the room was empty. The chair was dry. The pool of water was gone. The smell of the sea had vanished, replaced by the ordinary dust of an old house. They found Josiah sitting on the floor, leaning against the wall. He was alive, but he was gone. His eyes, which had once held a rock star-esque fire, and then an obsessive-esque gleam, were now as empty as the ghost-esque had been. He was catatonic, unresponsive. The debt had been collected. The creditor had taken the only currency left, the man himself. Lauren and Alina had him committed to a quiet, private institution by the sea. He spends his days there, in a sunroom with a view of the water. He does not speak. He does not read. He just sits, and his right hand, resting on the arm of his plastic chair, rises, hovers for a moment in the still air, and then descends to trace an endless, silent pattern on the smooth, unyielding surface. Up, hover, down. Up, hover, down. Lauren visits once a month. She brings him things he does not acknowledge: a book, some fruit. She sits with him for an hour, watching the sunlight move across the floor. She no longer paints. The experience drained the color from her world for good. But she is free. The house was sold. The chair burned to ashes, and the ashes scattered far out to sea. Sometimes, sitting there in the quiet sunroom, she watches his hand, and she thinks she understands. The ghost was not vengeful, not in the end. It was lonely. It had spent over a century searching the empty rooms of its grief, and it had found, in Josiah, a soul so attuned to darkness that it could finally be seen. And in taking him, it had found a companion for its eternal vigil. The haunting was not an attack. It was an adoption. She stands to leave, her shadow long in the afternoon light. She does not say goodbye. She simply walks away down the clean, bright corridor, her footsteps echoing softly. Behind her, Josiah continues his silent, patient tracing. A man keeping time in a room where time has stopped. A sentinel for a sorrow that will never, ever end. The sun shines on the calm, blue sea outside the window. The water is very still. The silence in the sunroom was a physical presence, thick and heavy as wool. Lauren reached the end of the corridor and pushed the heavy door open. The mundane noise of the outside whirled a distant lawnmower, a car door slamming feeling like a violation. She never looked back. The doctor said there was no change, no deterioration, no hope of improvement. Josiah was a perfectly preserved vessel, emptied of everything but the ritual. Months turned into a year. Lauren moved to a small city inland, where the air smelled of dry grass and asphalt, not salt. She got a job in a frame shop, her hands learning the practical geometry of matting and glass, a clean, precise counterpoint to the messy chaos of paint. She never picked up a brush. The desire was gone, extinguished as completely as the candle flame in Blackfield House. She thought of Josiah less often, the memory of his vacant eyes becoming a familiar, dull ache instead of a sharp pain. It was on a Tuesday, while cutting a mount for a bright, insipid watercolor of flowers, that the call came. The head nurse from the institution, a woman whose voice was always infuriatingly calm, was on the line. There had been a development, she said. Not a medical one. Something unusual. Lauren drove the 2 hours to the coast, her hands tight on the steering wheel. She expected the worst: a illness, a decline, death. She was not prepared for what she found. Josiah was in his usual spot by the window, but his hand was still. It lay motionless on the arm of the plastic chair, pale and limp. The ceaseless tracing had stopped. For the first time since that night, he was looking out the window, not at the sky or the trees, but at the sea. His expression had not regained its life, but the utter emptiness had been replaced by something else. A deep, focused attention. A waiting. The nurse stood beside Lauren. "It started 3 days ago," she whispered. "He just stopped. And he's been like this ever since, every day, from about 3 in the afternoon until the sun sets. He doesn't respond to us, but he's different." Lauren approached him slowly. "Josiah." He gave no sign of hearing her. His gaze was fixed on the horizon, on the thin, gray line where the sea met the sky. The water that day was not still. It was choppy, capped with white, and the sky was a uniform sheet of low cloud. A storm was brewing far out to sea. She sat with him for a long time, watching him watch the water. The old dread began to creep back, cold and familiar. This was not a recovery. This was a new phase. The ritual had been a marking of time, a steady beat in the stillness. This was a gathering, a focusing. As the afternoon wore on, the room grew darker with the approaching weather. The lights in the sunroom flickered on automatically, a sterile, yellow glow against the gathering gloom outside. And then Josiah moved. His head tilted, just slightly, as if he had heard a distant sound. A faint, almost imperceptible shudder ran through his body. Lauren smelled it then. Faint, but unmistakable, cutting through the antiseptic hospital smell. It was the smell of salt and brine, not the fresh salt of the sea, but the stale, suffocating salt of a body long submerged. The smell of Blackfield House. She stood up, her heart hammering against her ribs. She looked at Josiah, and for a single, terrifying second, she thought she saw a reflection in his eyes that was not from the room, the image of a dark, velvet chair. His hand twitched. The index finger lifted from the plastic, hovered in the air for a moment that stretched into an eternity, and then began to trace again. But the motion was different. It was no longer a mindless, vertical pattern. Up, hover, down. This was slower, more deliberate. It was a circle. A slow, endless circle on the arm of the chair. He was no longer keeping time. He was turning a wheel. He was at the helm. Lauren turned and walked quickly from the room, her footsteps loud and hurried on the linoleum. She did not stop at the nurse's station. She did not look back. She knew the haunting was over. The adoption was complete. But the vigil had simply changed location. Josiah was not a sentinel in a quiet room anymore. He was a captain, bound to a different kind of chair, staring out at a sea that would never give up its dead, waiting for a ship that would never come home. And somewhere in the deep, dark water, his crew was waiting with him. The drive back to the city was a blur of gray highway and the rhythmic thump of the windshield wipers. The storm had finally hit, and rain sheeted down, obscuring the world. Lauren S. mind was a blank, a defensive emptiness she clung to. She focused on the yellow lines of the road, the hiss of the tires on wet asphalt, anything to avoid the image of Josiah S. finger tracing that terrible, patient circle. She did not go home. She drove to the frame shop, the familiar space a sanctuary of order. The bright watercolor of flowers was still on the counter where she had left it. She picked up her utility knife, the weight of it solid and real in her hand. She slid the sharp blade along the metal ruler, cutting a fresh mat with a clean, satisfying slice. This was a world she could control. This was a world without ghosts. But that night, in her silent apartment, the control shattered. She dreamed not of Josiah, but of water. She was standing on a shore, but it was not a beach of sand. It was a shore of dark, polished wood, lapped by a black, silent sea. A single object floated in the water, just beyond her reach. A child's small, sodden leather shoe. She woke with a gasp, the taste of salt thick in her mouth. The next day, she called the institution. The nurse reported no change. Josiah was still tracing the circle. The smell, she admitted hesitantly when pressed, had lingered in the sunroom for a few hours before dissipating. Lauren hung up and knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that she had been wrong. The debt was paid, but the account was still open. It was an inheritance, and Josiah was not its only heir. A week later, a package arrived at the frame shop. It was a flat, rectangular parcel, wrapped in plain brown paper and tied with string. There was no return address, but the postmark was from a small coastal town north of where the institution stood. Her hands trembled as she cut the string. Inside, carefully protected by layers of tissue, was a painting. It was not one of hers. It was an old, amateurish seascape, the oils cracked and darkened with age. It depicted a storm-tossed sea under a lurid green sky, and in the center, a schooner, its sails in tatters, was being swallowed by a monstrous wave. The signature in the corner was faded but legible. A go. A note was tucked into the tissue paper. The handwriting was the same spidery script as the letter that had summoned Aliner. It was from her. It read only, "He left this behind. I thought you should have it. I cannot look at it anymore." Lauren stared at the painting. The brush strokes were frantic, desperate. This was not a picture of a storm. It was a picture of a man's despair made manifest in pigment and oil. She could feel the pull of it, the same seductive darkness that had ensnared Josiah. It was an artifact, another piece of the haunting. She should destroy it, burn it, as she had burned the chair. But she didn't. Instead, she took it to the back of the shop. She selected a simple, black frame, nothing ornate, a box to contain it. As she measured and cut the glass, she avoided looking directly at the image. But she could feel it there, in her periphery, a vortex of grief. When the frame was assembled and the painting sealed behind the glass, it seemed quieter somehow, tamed. She hung it on the wall of her apartment in the hallway where the light was dim. She did not hang it as decoration. She hung it as a reminder, a warning. This was the legacy, not of a ghost, but of a sadness so profound it could echo through generations. Josiah was lost to it, a captain on a phantom ship. But she was still on the shore. Her hands could still cut a straight line, could still frame a world and give it borders. She would not paint again. The colors were gone. But she could frame the darkness. She could give it edges, and in doing so, perhaps keep it from spilling out and swallowing her whole. She looked at the painting one last time before turning off the light. The sea in the picture was forever raging, the ship forever sinking. But now, it was contained. The silence in her apartment was different now, punctuated by the faint, almost imperceptible creak of the floorboards at night, a sound that had never been there before. It was not the heavy, menacing tread of Blackfield House, but something lighter, more hesitant, a shuffling. Lauren told herself it was the old building settling, the pipes contracting in the cooling night air. She almost believed it. She threw herself into her work at the framed shop with a new intensity. She took on complicated, fussy jobs that required all her concentration, multi-opening mats for family portraits, shadow boxes for military medals, the precise alignment of museum glass. She welcomed the clients who were never satisfied, who demanded adjustments and refinements. Their petty concerns were a wall against the quiet. One such client, an elderly man with kind eyes, brought in a collection of pressed flowers to be framed for his granddaughter. As Lauren carefully arranged the delicate blossoms under the glass, her hand brushed against a sprig of sea lavender. The crisp, papery texture sent a jolt through her, a sensory memory so vivid it stole her breath. The smell of salt air, the cry of gulls, the feeling of Josiah's hand in hers on a bright, windy day before the darkness had taken root. It was a memory from a life that belonged to someone else. She finished the job with mechanical efficiency, and when the man left, pleased, she retreated to the back room, her composure cracking. She leaned against the workbench, gripping the edge until her knuckles were white. The grief she had been holding back, the grief for the man Josiah had been, finally broke through. was a clean, sharp pain, and it was hers. It was not the borrowed, century-old anguish of Alistair Go. That night she dreamed again. This time, she was standing on the shore of dark wood. The single child-esque shoe was still there, but it was closer now, and she saw that it was not floating. It was resting on the surface, as if the water beneath it were as solid as glass. She took a step forward, and the surface held her weight. She woke not with a gasp, but with a strange calm. The apartment was silent. She walked out into the hallway and stood before the painting of the Sea Bride. In the dim light from the street, the frantic brushstrokes seemed softer, the lurid green of the sky muted. It was just a painting again, a sad, old painting. The haunting had not been in the chair, or the house, or even the painting. It was in the willingness to listen, the attraction to the whisper from the deep. Josiah had opened the door. She had spent every moment since then trying to slam it shut. She took the painting down from the wall. The next morning, she drove back to the coast, but not to the institution. She drove to a high, lonely cliff overlooking the sea. The wind whipped her hair, and the air was fresh and clean. She unwrapped the painting from its protective cloth. She looked once more at the doomed ship, at the artist's signature. Then, with a strength that surprised her, she hurled the entire thing, frame and glass, and all, over the edge. She watched it tumble end over end, a black rectangle against the vast gray sky, until it was swallowed by the waves far below. It was not an act of anger, or even of exorcism. It was a returning. She was giving it back to the sea. She did not visit Josiah again. She knew he was still there in his plastic chair, tracing his endless circle, a part of a story that was no longer hers. She had her own story to live on the shore in the light. A month later, on a whim, she bought a small set of watercolors. She did not try to paint a storm or a ship or a ghost. She painted the simple, sturdy pot of basil sitting on her windowsill, catching the afternoon sun. The green was timid at first, but it was green. It was a start. The first stroke of green was a shock against the white paper, a declaration of life in a world she had let go gray. She worked slowly, her hand remembering the old movements with a shy, unfamiliar grace. The basil leaves were not just green, they were 100 different greens, with veins of yellow and edges touched by the sun. She mixed the colors carefully, finding a quiet joy in the alchemy. When she was done, the painting was simple, imperfect, but it was hers. It held no echo of sorrow. She framed it herself, choosing a slender, silver frame that seemed to hold the light. She hung it in her kitchen, where she would see it every morning. The act felt like a planting, a small, defiant flag on a new shore. Life did not become magically easy. The silence in her apartment still held its whispers, and some nights she would wake, certain she could hear the faint, rhythmic sound of a finger tracing a circle on a smooth surface. But the sound no longer filled her with dread. It was just a sound, a memory, a story that was over. She would get up, make a cup of tea, and look at her painting of the basil plant until the feeling passed. She began to paint other small things. A single pear on the counter, the pattern of rain on her window. Her world, which had seemed drained of color, began to reveal its subtle hues again. She saw beauty in the grain of the wood on her workbench, in the way the light fell across the floor tiles at a certain hour. She was not trying to capture grand emotions or cosmic truths. She was just bearing witness to the quiet, persistent fact of things. One afternoon, a woman came into the frame shop with a large, rolled-up canvas. She unfurled it on the counter with a flourish. It was a vibrant, chaotic abstract, full of furious reds and deep, sorrowful blues. "It's about my divorce," the woman said, her voice tight with feeling. "I need a frame that contains the chaos, but doesn't stifle it. You understand?" Lauren looked at the painting, at the raw emotions splashed across it. She thought of Alistair Goe's seascape, of the torment trapped in its cracks. She thought of the darkness that could be framed, but never truly tamed. "I think I do," Lauren said softly. She showed the woman a simple, deep-set black frame. "This will give it a border, a place to exist. The rest," she said, meeting the woman's anxious eyes, "is up to you." The woman nodded, relieved, and Lauren set to work. As she measured the canvas, she felt a sense of peace. She was not an exorcist of ghosts, nor a savior of lost souls. She was a framer. Her job was not to explain the picture, or to heal the pain within it. Her job was simply to give it an edge, to define where the art stopped and the world began. It was a good job. It was enough. Later at home, she looked out her window at the city lights beginning to glitter in the twilight. Somewhere far away, the sea was moving, constant and eternal. But here inland, the air was still. She picked up her brush, dipped it in water, and touched it to a cake of paint, watching the color bloom. It was a soft, quiet blue, the color of a peaceful evening sky. She began to paint. The blue spread across the paper, a gentle wash that held the promise of depth. She wasn't painting anything in particular, just the feeling of the sky at this precise moment, the way the light softened the edges of the buildings. It was an exercise in presence, a way of anchoring herself in the now. The phone rang, its shrill tone a sharp intrusion into the quiet. She let it go to the machine, her brush hovering over the paper. After the beep, the voice of the head nurse from the institution filled the room, still infuriatingly calm. "Ms. Evans, this is just a routine update. No change in Mr. Ainsley's condition. He remains stable." There was a pause, a faint rustle of paper. "One thing, though. The orderlies have noted that the pattern has become more pronounced. The circle he traces is deeper now. It's wearing a groove into the plastic of the chair arm. We'll likely have to replace it soon. I just thought you should know." The message ended. Lauren stood frozen, the blue paint dripping from her brush onto the table, forming a small, dark puddle. A groove. He was not just tracing a memory, he was carving a channel. The image flashed in her mind. Josiah, anchored to his chair, wearing down the material world with the relentless pressure of his fixation. It was a different kind of erosion, slow and inevitable. She looked down at the spoiled painting, the serene blue marred by the drop of excess color. She did not feel the old panic, the urge to flee. Instead, she felt a dull, heavy sadness. The story was not over for him. It might never be, but her part in it was. She picked up a cloth and wiped up the spill. Then she took a fresh sheet of paper. She would start again. The blue would be different this time, perhaps a little deeper, acknowledging the shadow, but not being consumed by it. The phone sat silent on its cradle, a black shape in the corner of the room. She did not unplug it, but she knew she would not answer it again. Some calls did not require a response. Some vigils had to be kept alone. She dipped her brush back into the water, cleansing it, ready for the next color. The new blue was indeed deeper, a twilight shade that held a memory of the day's light, but accepted the coming night. She worked until her neck was stiff, and the city outside her window was a tapestry of electric stars. The finished painting was not of the skyline, but of the window itself, a square of darkness punctuated by the distant, anonymous lights. It was a frame within a frame. Weeks turned into a season. The shop thrived. She found herself offering gentle advice to customers, helping them choose not just a frame, but a context for their memories. She learned the stories behind the graduation photos and the wedding portraits, the faded maps, and the children's drawings. She was building a gallery of other people's lives, and the work felt like a kind of healing. The call about the chair came on a Tuesday. A different nurse, her voice younger, less practiced at delivering odd news. They had replaced the plastic armrest on Josiah's chair. The old one was deeply scored, a perfect, smooth channel worn by his finger. The maintenance man, she said, had remarked on it. He said it looked like a rope groove, the kind worn into a ship's cleat from years of a line being tied and untied. Lauren thanked her and hung up. She pictured the piece of white plastic sitting in some medical waste bin, a fossil of a relentless, private ritual. The sea had taken the painting, but Josiah was still etching his own monument. She felt a pang, not of fear, but of a profound and helpless pity. He was still sailing, still tending to his phantom ship in that sunlit room. That evening, she walked to the park instead of going straight home. She sat on a bench and watched the people, the dogs, the ordinary flow of life on dry land. A little girl ran past, chasing a bubble, her laughter clear and bright. The sound was a bell, cutting through the fog of Lauren's thoughts. It was a sound that had no place in the world of the sea bride. She realized then that she had been waiting for a sign, for some cosmic confirmation that Josiah was at peace, that the debt was truly closed. But that sign would never come. Peace was not something that happened to you. It was something you built day by day from small, defiant acts of life, like painting a basil plant, like framing a window, like listening to a child laugh. She stood up and walked home, her steps light on the pavement. The apartment welcomed her with its familiar smells of citrus cleaner and the faint, earthy scent of her paints. She did not glance at the empty space on the hallway wall. She went to her desk and opened a sketchbook. She picked up a pencil, not a brush, and began to draw. Not a memory, not a dream, idea. A simple, elegant frame design she had been turning over in her mind for a client's wedding photograph. The lines were clean, the corners joined with precision. It was a structure meant to celebrate, to protect, to honor a beginning. She worked late into the night, and for the first time in a very long time, she did not dream of the water. The design was for a double frame, 2 openings side by side, a physical representation of a union. She fell asleep at her desk, her head pillowed on her arms, and woke with the dawn light filtering through the window. A line from the pencil etched faintly on her cheek. The stiffness in her neck was a small price to pay for a night of dreamless sleep. The client loved the design. As Lauren assembled the frame, selecting a warm, honey-toned wood, she felt a sense of rightness. This was her shore. This was her work. The haunting, she understood now, was a choice. It was the choice to keep listening to the whisper, to keep staring into the vortex. Josiah had made his choice. She had made hers. A year passed. The calls from the institution became less frequent, then stopped altogether. She assumed Josiah was the same, a permanent resident of that quiet, sunlit purgatory. She thought of him sometimes, a distant figure on a faraway beach, but the thoughts were no longer accompanied by the old, chilling dread. They were just thoughts, like memories of a book she had read long ago. One rainy afternoon, a man came into the shop, shaking water from his coat. He was around her age, with a kind, open face and eyes that crinkled at the corners when he smiled. He needed a frame for a poster, a vintage travel advertisement for a place she had never heard of. They talked about the design, about the muted colors of the poster, and he mentioned he had just moved to the city. His name was David. He came back a week later to pick up the finished frame, and he asked if she would like to get a coffee sometime. She hesitated for only a moment, the old instinct to retreat rising like a wall. But she looked at him, at his easy smile, and she thought of the basil plant on her windowsill, its stubborn, everyday green. She said yes. They went to a small cafe down the street. The coffee was bitter. The conversation was easy. He was a teacher, and he told her funny stories about his students. He asked her about her work, and she found herself talking about framing not as a craft, but as a philosophy, about giving things borders. He listened, truly listened, and he didn't look at her as if she were strange. Walking home alone afterwards, the rain had stopped, leaving the streets slick and reflective. She felt a lightness in her chest, a sensation so unfamiliar it was almost alarming. It was the absence of a weight she had grown so accustomed to carrying she had forgotten it was there. She was not betraying Josiah by feeling this. She was simply living. The account was not just closed, it was settled, its pages turned. That night, she dreamed of the shore of dark wood again. But this time, the single child's shoe was gone. The surface was perfectly smooth, reflecting a clear, calm sky. She stood there for a long time, not waiting for anything, just breathing. When she woke, the memory of the dream was not a disturbance, but a quiet reassurance. The water was still. she was still on the shore. And for the first time in years, that was exactly where she wanted to be. The morning after the dream, the air in her apartment felt different, lighter. The memory of the calm, reflective surface lingered, not as a haunting, but as a kind of internal weather. She made her coffee and stood by the window, watching the city come to life. The day held no particular dread, no undercurrent of ancient sorrow. It was just a day. David called later that week, and they went to see a movie. Sitting in the dark, their shoulders almost touching, Lauren was acutely aware of the simple, human warmth radiating from him. It was a comfort, not a complication. Afterward, they walked through the neon-lit streets, and he told her about growing up in a small town near a lake, not an ocean. He described the way the water froze solid in the winter, how you could walk right out onto it. The image was so foreign to her experience of the sea, so solid and certain, that it made her smile. She began to see him regularly. It was never dramatic or intense, just a gradual intertwining of lives. He admired her watercolors, not with the awe of someone seeing great art, but with the genuine pleasure of someone appreciating a skill. He brought her a small, terracotta pot of thyme from the farmer's market, because he said it smelled like sunshine. She placed it next to the basil on her windowsill. One Saturday, he helped her clean out a cluttered storage closet in the shop. They found boxes of old sample moldings and discarded mats. At the back of the closet, wrapped in a dusty sheet, was the chair. The old, heavy armchair from her apartment. She had brought it to the shop months ago, meaning to refinish it or sell it, but had simply shoved it in the closet and forgotten about it. David pulled off the sheet. "This is a great piece," he said, running a hand over the carved wood. "Solid, a little worn, but it has character." Lauren looked at it. The dark wood, the high back. It was just a chair. The ghost had long since vacated it. "It was my ex's," she said, the words coming out more easily than she expected. "It has a history." David nodded, not pressing for details. "Well," he said, "history can be sanded down, restained. We could make it new again if you want." The word hung in the dusty air between them. Lauren looked from the chair to David's open, practical face. He was offering not an exorcism, but a renovation. A future. "Yes," she said, feeling a final, quiet click of something settling into place. "I think I would like that." They spent the afternoon together, sanding the old varnish away. The dust motes danced in the sunlight streaming through the shop window. The rhythmic sound of the sandpaper was not a ghostly tracing, but the sound of work, of building something. Underneath the dark stain, the wood was a warm, honey-colored oak. It had been hiding there all along. The scent of fresh wood filled the shop. A clean, promising smell that pushed the last of the old shadows into the corners. They worked until their arms were tired, and then they went for pizza, laughing as they tried to brush the fine dust from each other's clothes. That night, Lauren slept deeply, and if she dreamed, it was of sunlight on warm wood, not of dark water. The refinished chair found a new home in a corner of her living room, a bright yellow cushion softening its seat. It no longer looked like a throne for sorrow. It looked like a place to sit and read, or to watch the evening light change. David came over often, and they would sit there together, talking or in comfortable silence. The chair held their presence lightly, without echo. One evening, as summer was fading into autumn, Lauren was washing the brushes from a painting session. Her latest work was propped on the easel, a study of the thyme plant, its tiny leaves rendered in delicate strokes of green and gray. David was looking at it thoughtfully. "You know," he said, "your paintings are so still, so peaceful, but there's a strength in them, a kind of resilience." Lauren wiped her hands on a rag, considering his words. She looked at the painting, then out the window at the deepening blue of the twilight. "I think I'm just painting what I see now," she said, "not what I'm afraid of seeing." He came and stood beside her, slipping an arm around her waist. "It's a good way to see." The phone rang. It was a sound that had lost its power to startle her. She picked it up without hesitation. It was the institution. The voice on the other end was one she didn't recognize, administrative and brisk. "Ms. Evans, this is regarding the estate of Josiah Ainsley. I'm sorry to inform you that Mr. Ainsley passed away peacefully in his sleep last night." Lauren listened as the woman gave the details. There would be no funeral. The body would be cremated, the ashes scattered at sea, according to the instructions in a very old will. The process was efficient, detached. Josiah Ainsley, the last of his line, was being tidied away. She thanked the woman and hung up. She stood for a moment, the receiver still in her hand, waiting for the wave of grief to hit. But it didn't come. Instead, she felt a vast, quiet emptiness, like a room that had been cleared out after a long tenancy. The story was finally, truly over. The last page had been turned. The circle was complete. "Everything okay?" David asked, his voice gentle. She turned to him. "It was about Josiah," she said. "He's gone." He searched her face, looking for the pain he expected to find. When he saw only a profound calm, he simply nodded and drew her into a hug. She rested her head against his shoulder, breathing in the familiar, solid scent of him. Later, she went to the window. The sky was fully dark now, a deep, starless velvet. Somewhere out there, his ashes would be meeting the water. She felt no urge to go to the shore, to watch or to mourn. He was back with his sea, and she was here, on her shore. There was a rightness to it, a symmetry that required no ceremony. She thought of the worn groove in the plastic chair, the fossil of his obsession. The sea would have smoothed it away by now, just as it smoothed stones and sand. Everything returned, eventually, to a state of grace. She turned away from the window and looked at her apartment, at the paintings on the walls, at the refinished chair, at David waiting for her on the sofa. The light in the room was warm and golden. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was was her life. The next morning, she woke with the sun. The knowledge of Josiah's passing was there, a settled fact in her mind, but it did not cast a pall over the day. She made coffee and sat in the redone chair, feeling the smooth, cool wood of the arms under her palms. There were no grooves here, only the gentle patina of a new beginning. She went to the shop and opened as usual. The bell above the door chimed its familiar note. A woman came in with a delicate, antique sampler she wanted framed. Lauren handled the fragile fabric with care, discussing the merits of a non-glare glass that would protect the faded threads from the light. The work was absorbing, a conversation about preservation and honor. In the late afternoon, David stopped by after his classes ended. He brought 2 cups of tea and a paper bag containing 2 still warm apple fritters. They sat in the back of the shop amidst the scents of wood glue and paper. "You're sure you're all right?" he asked, not with pity, but with a simple, caring curiosity. "I am," Lauren said, and found that she meant it completely. "It feels like a story I read a long time ago has finally been returned to the library. The cover is closed. It's back on the shelf." He smiled at that. A good library has plenty of shelves, room for new stories. She nodded, looking around her shop, at the frames waiting for their pictures, the blank mats ready to define a space around a memory. She was a curator of stories, not a prisoner of one. A few weeks later, a small, flat package arrived in the mail. The return address was the law firm that had handled Josiah's estate. For a moment, her breath caught, a last, faint echo of the old anxiety. She sliced the package open with a utility knife. Inside, protected by layers of stiff cardboard, was a drawing. It was on a sheet of thick, yellowed paper, clearly very old. The rendering was precise, technical, the work of a draftsman, not an artist. It was a detailed schematic of a ship's figurehead, a woman with a serene face and flowing hair, her hands crossed over her chest. In the bottom corner, in a spidery, faded ink, was written, "The Sea Bride, for my son, Josiah." Lauren held the paper carefully by its edges. This was the ghost. This was the image that had haunted him, the namesake of his doomed ship. It was not a monster. It was just a drawing, a father's gift, a plan for a piece of wood that was never meant to touch the water. The weight of the tragedy seemed to shrink, condensing from a mythic storm into a simple, human error of ambition and love. She did not know what to do with it. She could not hang it on her wall. It did not belong to her story, but she could not throw it away. It was a piece of Josiah's truth, the core of the obsession that had consumed him. She took a fresh sheet of her own watercolor paper and a pencil. She did not copy the drawing. Instead, she drew a simple, deep-edged box, a tray made to fit the schematic exactly. She lined it with acid-free tissue. It was an archive box, a coffin for a ghost. She placed the drawing inside, closed the lid, and stored it on a high shelf in her shop closet, behind the sample books. It was safe. It was contained. It had a border. That night, she and David walked to the edge of the city, to a park that overlooked the river, not the sea. The water was brown and slow-moving, a working waterway, not a realm of mystery. They sat on a bench and watched the lights of the bridges reflect on the surface. "I got something in the mail today," she said, "from Josiah's estate." It was the drawing of the figurehead. David was quiet for a moment, listening to the distant hum of traffic. "What did you do with it?" "I put it away," she said, "in a box I made for it." He took her hand. His was warm. "That sounds like the right thing to do." And it was. The past was boxed, not buried, because burial implied something might grow from it. This was simply stored, its power neutralized. The water before them flowed steadily, indifferently toward the ocean. But here, by the river, it was just water. And she was just a woman, sitting on a bench, holding the hand of a man she was coming to love. The air was cool, and the future stretched out before them, vast and unknown, and entirely their own. Story 2. The chair was always the first thing I noticed when I walked into the room, even before I looked at him. It was just a simple ladder-back chair, the wood a pale, honey-colored maple, the spindles worn smooth by generations of hands. My grandfather had made it, and it had sat in the corner of our dining room for years, a quiet, unassuming piece of furniture. But after Jean was born, it migrated to his nursery, and then, as he grew, it took up a permanent station in the far corner of his bedroom. It was never used for sitting. It was a sentinel, and in the dim light of a winter afternoon, with the dust motes dancing in the slanted rays of the sun, I could sometimes convince myself that it was not a chair at all, but a strange, skeletal creature frozen in a state of perpetual observation. Its 4 legs rooted to the floorboards, its high back a rigid spine, its empty space between the spindles a row of unblinking eyes. We had wanted a big family. Clara and I. It was a desire that felt as natural and inevitable as the turning of the seasons. Our house was a large, old Victorian on a quiet, tree-lined street in a town that prided itself on its solid, unshakable normalcy. We had 4 children in 6 years. David, serious and kind. Sarah, all laughter and light. Then the twins, Michael and Matthew, a whirlwind of matching overalls and mischief. The house was filled with the good sounds, the sounds of life, the thump of small feet running on hardwood, the murmur of bedtime stories, the warm, yeasty smell of bread Clara baked on Saturdays. Our life was a perfect, self-contained world, a snow globe of happiness. We were so sure of its boundaries, of its walls. We never imagined that a 5th child could be a key that would unlock a door we never knew was there, a door leading not to another room, but to different sky altogether. Jean S. birth was difficult, a long and bloody struggle that left Clara pale and hollowed out for weeks. He was different from the start, not in any way you could point to on a chart or measure with a caliber, but in the subtle, unsettling language of instinct. He did not cry so much as issue a low, guttural sound, a vibration that seemed to come from deep within the earth rather than and from a pair of newborn lungs. His eyes, a blue so dark it was almost black, did not have the unfocused gaze of an infant. They were old eyes, watchful and knowing, and they followed you around the room with an intensity that was frankly unnerving. He was a quiet baby, unnaturally so. He never cooed or babbled. He simply observed, a tiny, silent judge in a crib. The other children sensed it first, as children do. David, who had been so eager to hold his new brother, would only peer at him from the doorway. His small face creased with a confusion that was too old for his years. Sarah's songs, which she sang to him in a sweet, off-key voice, would trail off into silence under the weight of his unblinking stare. The twins, usually a riot of uncontrolled energy, would grow quiet and still when they entered his room, their usual boisterousness dampened as if by an invisible fog. The chair in the corner seemed to gather their unease, to absorb it, and on certain evenings I would swear I could feel a coldness radiating from its wooden frame. He grew, but not in the way a child should. It was not a process of unfolding, of gradual discovery, but something more like an emergence. He learned to walk with a strange, deliberate grace, his small feet making almost no sound on the floor. He never spoke a word. Not mama, not dada. He would point a single imperious finger to indicate his needs. And his needs were simple: food, which he consumed with a terrifying, single-minded voracity, and solitude. He preferred to be alone in his room, sitting on the floor facing that empty chair, as if engaged in a silent, ongoing conversation. We took him to doctors, of course, a parade of them: pediatricians, neurologists, specialists with kind eyes and expensive diplomas on their walls. They poked and prodded. They scanned his brain and tested his hearing. They used words like nonverbal, on the spectrum, a unique developmental trajectory. They were good men and women, I believe, trying to fit his squareness into the round holes of their medical textbooks, but their diagnoses felt like thin sheets of tissue paper laid over a bottomless chasm. They could name the silence, but they could not explain the quality of it, the dense, heavy presence of it that filled our home. They could not account for the way the household pets, first the cat, then the old Labrador, would slink away from him, their tails between their legs, or simply vanish altogether one day, never to return. The unraveling was slow, a thread pulled from a sweater until the entire garment is a tangle of yarn at your feet. Family gatherings, once a source of joy, became exercises in quiet horror. My mother would hold Jean for a moment, her smile tight, and then hand him back to Clara, as if passing along a burden that was too heavy to bear. "He-es a quiet one, isn't he?" she'd say, and the words were a judgment. My brother, a bluff, hearty man who coached Little League, would clap me on the shoulder too hard and say, "Don't worry, he'll grow out of it." Boys are strange creatures. But his eyes would dart away from mine, and he would never, ever ask to hold his nephew. Society, that great, grinding machine of conformity, began to exert its pressure. Playgroups were a disaster. The other children would cluster together, a noisy, organic mass, while Jean would stand apart, a solitary rock in a flowing stream. The other mothers would watch him, their conversations faltering, their smiles becoming strained. The invitations dwindled, then stopped altogether. We became that family, the one with the strange boy, the house that was best avoided on Halloween. The silence that had begun with Jean seeped out from his room and into the very walls of our home. The laughter of our other children became more infrequent, muted. They stopped bringing friends over. David started spending more time at the library. Sarah buried herself in books, and the twins fought with a new, desperate ferocity, as if trying to punch their way back into the bright, noisy world we had all once inhabited. Clara bore the brunt of it. The light in her eyes, which had been the very sun of our family, began to dim. She would sit for long hours in the kitchen after the children were in bed, staring at her hands, which were always moving, twisting a napkin or tracing the grain of the wooden table. "He-s ours, Ben," she would whisper, her voice thin and frayed. "We have to love him. What else is there?" But it was a question, not a statement. And I heard the terror in it. The love we felt for Jean was a complex, thorny thing, tangled up with fear and a profound, soul-shaking weariness. It was not the easy, overflowing love we had for our other children. It was a duty, a heavy chain of responsibility. And some nights, in the deepest, darkest hours, I feared it was not love at all, but only the ghost of it, a habit we maintained to keep ourselves from screaming. The incident that finally broke us happened on a Tuesday. It was autumn, and the leaves were a brilliant, dying fire in the trees. Sarah had left her favorite doll, a porcelain thing with rosy cheeks and blonde ringlets, on the sofa. Jean was sitting on the floor nearby. I was reading the paper. I saw him crawl over to the doll, not with a child-esque curiosity, but with that same deliberate, purposeful motion. He didn't try to hug it or talk to it. He simply looked at it, his head cocked to one side. Then, with one small, strong hand, he pressed his thumb into the doll's painted blue eye. There was a soft crunch, a sound of tiny fractures. He didn't smash it. He applied a steady, inexorable pressure until the eye socket collapsed into a web of cracked porcelain. He then did the same to the other eye. When he was done, he set the sightless doll gently back on the cushion and returned to his place on the floor, his expression unchanged. Sarah's scream, when she found it was a sound I will carry to my grave. It wasn't just the loss of a toy. It was the violation, the chilling, calculated nature of the act. We couldn't explain it away as a tantrum or an accident. It was a statement. When I tried to talk to Jean, to look into those dark, ancient eyes, I saw nothing I could recognize as my son. I saw a landscape that was cold and alien, a place where the rules of our world did not apply. That night, I found myself standing in the doorway of his room. He was asleep in his bed, a small, still mound under the blanket. The moon was full, and its cold light poured through the window, illuminating the chair in the corner. And in that silver light, I saw it. I know I saw it. The chair was no longer empty. A shape sat there, a form woven from shadow and moonlight, a tall, thin silhouette that was at once man and not man. It had no discernible features, only a profound and absolute darkness where a face should be. It did not move. It simply was. And I knew, with a certainty that froze the blood in my veins, that it was not looking at Jean. It was looking at me. I did not scream. I did not run. A strange, hypnotic calm settled over me. This was the answer. This was the source of the silence, the watchfulness, the otherness. Jean was not alone. He had never been alone. He was a bridge, a conduit, a door left ajar. And something had come through from the other side and taken a seat in the corner of my son S room, and it had no intention of leaving. Life goes on as it must. We still live in the same house. David is away at college now. Sarah is a quiet, watchful teenager. The twins are sullen and distant. Clara moves through the days like a sleepwalker, her love for me, and for our first 4 children, a desperate, flickering candle in a vast and windy dark. We never speak of that night. We never speak of the chair. We have become experts in a new kind of silence, one that is thick with things unsaid. Jean is 11 now. He still does not speak. He still sits for hours, facing the corner. The chair is still there. And sometimes, when the light is just right or wrong, I will glance into that room and see it. Not a shape, not a shadow, but a suggestion, a pressure, a presence that makes the air itself feel thick and heavy. I no longer try to convince myself it is a trick of the light. I know what it is. It is a tenant. It is a guardian. It is a patient watcher at the threshold. And I know, with a certainty that is both terrifying and strangely comforting, that it is waiting. Not for anything as simple as a word or a sign. It is waiting for a culmination, a alignment of stars, a final, silent nod from the small, dark-eyed boy who is my son and is not my son. It is waiting for the door to open fully, and on some nights, when the wind is still and the house holds its breath, I think I can almost hear it, the faint, dry rustle of its patience, a sound like old pages turning in a forgotten book. I stand at the threshold, a father protecting a home that is no longer his, and I wait with it. The waiting had become its own kind of presence in the house. A 5th child grown large and oppressive. It was in the way Clara would pause while washing dishes, her hands suspended in the soapy water, her gaze fixed on nothing. It was in the careful path we all took through the hall, giving Jean S. door a wide berth as if it were the mouth of a cave. We had perfected the art of avoidance, a delicate dance around the void that was our son. My work suffered. I was an architect, and my profession was one of lines and angles, of creating order from empty space. But now, my blueprints seemed like childish scrawls. How could I design structures meant to last a century when I felt the foundations of my own world turning to sand? I sit at my drafting table and find myself sketching not buildings, but the same thing over and over. The ladder-back chair, its spindles stretching like ribs, the empty space between them a gateway. My partner, Mark, a jovial man who had always admired my solid, Midwestern sensibility, started looking at me with concern. "Ben, you look tired," he'd say. maybe take a few days. Be with the family. Didn't he understand that being with the family was the source of the exhaustion? Sarah, my once vibrant daughter, had become a ghost in her own home. She spent most of her time in her room, the door closed, the faint sound of her music the only sign she was there. I tried to reach her once, knocking softly before entering. She was at her desk, but she wasn't doing homework. She was drawing, her hand moving in frantic, angry strokes. The page was filled with eyes. Not human eyes, but large, lidless orbs, all pupil, staring out from the paper with a cold intensity. She saw me looking and quickly swept her arm over the drawing, her face flushing with a mixture of shame and defiance. "It's nothing," she muttered. I wanted to hug her, to tell her it would be all right, but the lie stuck in my throat. We both knew it wouldn't be. The twins, Michael and Matthew, dealt with the pressure in their own way. Their fights became more than just sibling rivalry. They were brutal physical explosions that left bruises and broken furniture. It was as if they were trying to fill the house's silence with noise, any noise, even if it was the sound of their own pain. After one particularly bad fight over a video game controller that ended with a bloody nose and a shattered lamp, I pulled them apart. They were both crying, but it wasn't the hurt cry of children. It was a raw, ragged sound of pure frustration. Why can things be like they were? Matthew screamed, not at his brother, but at me, his small body trembling. I had no answer for him. It was a Thursday evening when the change began. I was reading in the living room, a book I wasn't absorbing when I felt it. A shift in the air. It was the same feeling you get before a thunderstorm, a sudden, static charge that makes the hairs on your arm stand up. I looked up. The house was quiet, but it was a different quiet. The usual, heavy silence from Jean's room was gone. In its place was attentiveness. I set my book down and walked to the hallway. The door to Jean's room was open a crack. This in itself was unusual. It was always closed, a tacit agreement between all of us. I approached slowly, my heart a dull hammer in my chest. I peered through the opening. Jean was not sitting on the floor. He was standing in the middle of the room, facing the chair. His posture was different. It was not the placid, waiting stance I was used to. It was alert, expectant. The moonlight from the window did not touch the chair. It remained a pool of absolute darkness. But from that darkness, I saw a single, pale hand emerge. It was long and slender, the color of bone, and it did not look quite solid. It hovered in the air for a moment, then extended a finger, pointing not at Jean, but at the closed door of the room pointing. I realized with a jolt, directly at me. A cold worse than any winter chill seized me. It had acknowledged me. For 11 years, I had been an observer, a spectator to this slow invasion. Now I was seen. Before I could move, before I could even breathe, Jean turned his head. His dark eyes met mine through the crack in the door. And for the first time in his life, I saw an expression on his face. It wasn't a smile. It was a look of perfect, ancient recognition. It was the look a keeper gives a visitor when the appointed hour has finally arrived. Then his lips parted. No sound came out, but I heard the word as clearly as if he had shouted it in my ear. A single, silent syllable that hung in the charged air between us. Soon, the word did not fade. It seemed to lodge itself in the center of my mind. A cold, smooth stone dropped into the murky water of my thoughts. I stumbled back from the door, my shoulder hitting the wall with a dull thud. The hallway tilted. Soon. The word was both a promise and a threat. A countdown begun with no sense of the time remaining. I did not tell Clara. What would I say? That our nonverbal son had spoken a word directly into my mind. That the thing in the chair had pointed at me. She was hanging on by a thread so fine I feared the weight of this new horror would snap it entirely. I saw the question in her eyes the next morning when I couldn't touch my breakfast. My hands shaking so badly the coffee cup rattled in its saucer. "Bad night?" she asked, her voice flat. I just nodded, unable to meet her gaze. The atmosphere in the house changed palpably over the next few days. The oppressive waiting was over, replaced by a sharp, electric anticipation. It was worse. It was like the moment after the roller coaster clicks over the crest of the first hill, that terrifying lurch into freefall. Gene began to move through the house. He had always kept to his room, but now he would appear in doorways, silent and watching. He would stand at the top of the stairs while we ate dinner in the dining room below, a small, dark sentinel. He didn't want anything. He was just present, marking his territory. Sarah refused to come out of her room at all now. I brought her meals on a tray, finding her curled on her bed, her drawings of those lidless eyes scattered across the floor like fallen leaves. The twins' fights stopped. They huddled together in their room, speaking in low, urgent whispers, their former animosity forgotten in the face of this new, shared fear. The house was not silent anymore. It was filled with the sound of our dread. 3 nights after the word, I was lying awake next to Clara, listening to her shallow, troubled breathing. The house was still, too still. It was the kind of stillness that feels like a held breath. Then I heard it, a soft, scraping sound from downstairs. It was the sound of a chair leg being dragged across the kitchen floor. My blood turned to ice. I slipped out of bed, my movements slow and cautious. I didn't wake Clara. This was my burden. I crept down the stairs, each creak of the wood like a gunshot in the hush. The kitchen door was closed. A sliver of yellow light showed beneath it. We had not left a light on. I pushed the door open. The sight that met my eyes was so mundane, so utterly bizarre, that my mind refused to process it for a moment. Gene was sitting at the kitchen table. He was drinking a glass of milk, and seated across from him, in one of our ladder-back kitchen chairs, was the shape. It was more defined now, no longer just a silhouette of shadow. I could see the suggestion of a long, dark coat, the glint of something pale where a face should be. It was not looking at Gene. It was looking at the empty space on the table between them, as if they had been in the middle of a conversation. Jean finished his milk and set the glass down with a quiet click. He looked at the figure, then turned his head and looked directly at me, standing frozen in the doorway. His dark eyes were calm, serene. The figure did not turn. It simply raised one of those bone-white hands and made a slight, dismissive gesture. The message was clear. I was not part of this. I was an interruption. A hot, primal anger surged through me, burning away the fear. This was my house, my kitchen. That was my son. I took a step forward, my mouth opening to shout, to demand, to do something, anything. But no sound came out. The air in the room grew thick, syrupy. It pressed against me, a physical weight that stopped my forward motion and stole the breath from my lungs. I stood there, paralyzed, as Jean slid down from his chair. He walked past me without a glance, his small form moving with that same unnerving grace. The figure remained seated for a moment longer. Then it slowly, deliberately, turned its head. There were no eyes, no features, only a smooth, cold expanse that seemed to drink the light from the room. It regarded me for a long, endless moment. And then it was gone. Not like it vanished, but like it had never been there at all. The chair was just a chair. I sank to my knees on the cool linoleum, gasping for air. The kitchen was just a kitchen again, bathed in the weak glow of the overhead light. But everything was different. The rules had been rewritten. The tenant was no longer confined to the corner of a bedroom. It was moving through the house. It was sharing a glass of milk with my son. The door was not just open. It was swinging wide. The next morning, the kitchen was a monument to normalcy. Sunlight streamed through the window, catching the dust motes dancing in the air. The chair was pushed neatly under the table. There was no trace of the glass Jean had used. When I asked Clara if she had gotten up for water during the night, she shook her head, her eyes dull, with a sleep that was no longer restful. The evidence had been erased, leaving only the indelible mark on my memory. Jean S. forays into the common areas of the house became more frequent. He would sit in the living room while we watched television, not watching the screen, but sitting perfectly still on the very edge of the sofa, as if he were a guest waiting for an audience to conclude. The presence was always with him, a subtle distortion in the air, a chill that lingered in his wake. The family learned to navigate around him as if he were a piece of furniture that radiated a profound cold. Conversations became stilted, then ceased altogether when he was near. We were living alongside him, but we were no longer living with him. It was Sarah who finally broke. I came home from work to find her standing in the living room, her face pale and streaked with tears. She was pointing a trembling finger at Jean, who was sitting in his usual spot. "Make him stop," she whispered, her voice cracking. "He's humming." I listened. At first, I heard nothing but the frantic beating of my own heart. Then I caught it, a low vibration rather than a melody, a sound that seemed to emanate not from his throat, but from the space around him. It was a tuneless, rhythmic drone that set my teeth on edge. It was the sound of waiting distilled into noise. "I can't stand it," Sarah sobbed, clamping her hands over her ears. "It's all I can hear. It's in the walls." I moved to comfort her, but she flinched away from me, her eyes wild. "Don't you hear it? How can you not hear it?" She turned and fled up the stairs, the sound of her bedroom door slamming shut echoing through the house like a gunshot. I looked at Jean. His expression was placid, his dark eyes fixed on some point in the middle distance. The humming continued, a constant, invisible pressure in the room. I realized then that Sarah was right. I could hear it. I had been hearing it for days. A background resonance I had attributed to stress or fatigue. It was the sound of the thing in the chair. It was the sound of its patience, a vibration tuning our world to its own silent frequency. That was the last day Sarah left her room. Clara took her meals on a tray, returning each time looking more hollow, more defeated. She would look at me, and the unspoken question in her eyes had changed. It was no longer what is wrong with our son. It was what is going to happen to us. The answer came on a night of heavy, oppressive rain. The storm had knocked out the power, and we huddled in the living room by the guttering light of a few candles. The twins were asleep on the floor, exhausted by fear. Clara dozed fitfully in an armchair. I was the only one awake, watching the shadows dance on the walls, listening to the rain pound against the roof like frantic fists. Jean was there, of course. He stood by the dark fireplace, a small, still figure in the flickering light. The humming was louder tonight, a palpable thrum in the air that seemed to synchronize with the rhythm of the storm. Then it stopped. The sudden silence was more jarring than the noise had been. Jean turned from the fireplace and walked toward me. He stopped a few feet away, his face illuminated by the candle on the table beside my chair. For the second time in his life, his features were not blank. There was a focus, an intensity that made my blood run cold. He lifted his hand and pointed not at me, but at the staircase. A command. I felt a will other than my own take hold of my limbs. I stood up, my body moving as if I were a puppet. I walked past Clara and the sleeping twins, my feet carrying me toward the stairs. I did not want to go. Every fiber of my being screamed in protest, but I was no longer in control. I climbed the stairs, each step a heavy, reluctant effort. The hallway upstairs was a tunnel of darkness, but a faint, cold light spilled from the open doorway of Jean's room. I stopped at the threshold. The ladder-back chair was in the center of the room, positioned directly under the skylight where the rain streamed down in a silvery curtain. And sitting in the chair was the figure. It was more solid than I had ever seen it. The long coat seemed to be made of woven darkness, and the pale, featureless face was tilted upward, as if watching the rain. It did not move, but I felt its attention shift to me. Jean slipped past me into the room. He walked to the chair and stood beside it, placing one small hand on its arm. He looked at the figure, then at me. In his eyes, I saw no malice, no evil. I saw only a terrible, inevitable purpose. The figure slowly extended its bone-white hand. This time, it did not point. It beckoned, and from the depths of my soul, a voice that was not my own, a voice rusted with disuse and thick with a sorrow I could not comprehend, formed a single word in my mind. It was not a command, but an invitation, an offering of a truth I had spent 11 years running from. "Come," it said. "Come and see." The word was not a sound, but a key, turning a lock deep inside me that I never knew existed. The paralysis that had gripped me in the kitchen melted away, replaced by a dreadful gravitational pull. My fear did not vanish. It simply became irrelevant, a small, buzzing insect against the immense quiet of that summons. I took a step into the room. The air was different, colder and thinner, like the atmosphere at a high altitude. The sound of the rain on the skylight faded to a distant murmur. Jean watched me, his expression one of serene expectation. The figure in the chair remained still, its hand still extended in that silent invitation. I was halfway across the room when I heard a noise behind me. A soft, broken gasp. Clara stood in the doorway, her hand pressed to her mouth. Her eyes were wide with horror, reflecting the faint, unnatural light that emanated from the chair. She was seeing it. Not a shadow, not a trick of the light, but the full, solid presence of the tenant. The reality of it broke the last of her fragile composure. "Ben," she whispered, her voice trembling. "What is that? What is happening?" I wanted to go to her, to shield her from this, but my feet were rooted to the spot. The will that guided me was absolute. Jean turned his head toward his mother. For a brief moment, a flicker of something like sadness crossed his features. Then he looked back at the figure, and it was gone, replaced by that same blank purpose. The figure in the chair slowly lowered its hand. It did not turn to look at Clara. Instead, it shifted its weight, a subtle movement that signaled a change in intent. The focus was no longer solely on me. The invitation was widening. Clara took a hesitant step into the room, drawn by a terrible curiosity, by the need to finally understand the sickness that had consumed her son and her home. "Jean," she said, her voice pleading. "Baby, come away from there." But Jean didn't move. The figure raised its hand again, this time not in a beckoning gesture, but with the palm facing Clara, as if in a command to stop. She froze, a fresh wave of terror washing over her face. The voice in my mind spoke again, not to me, but through me. My lips moved, but the words were not my own. They were dry, ancient, and filled with a quiet finality. "The time for questions is over," I heard myself say. "The time for witnessing has begun." The figure in the chair leaned forward. The smooth, pale plane of its face seemed to ripple, and for a terrifying second, I thought a mouth would form, a gash to utter some unthinkable sound. But instead, the space in front of the chair began to darken, not into shadow, but into a deep, starless black. It was a window opening in the middle of the room, a view into an absolute void. from that void, things began to emerge. Not shapes, but sensations. A cold that was the absence of all heat. A silence that was the end of all sound. A loneliness so profound it felt like the death of the universe. I felt it pressing against my mind, not as an image, but as a raw, overwhelming truth. This was what waited. This was the patient, dry rustle in the house. This was the destination. I understood then why Jean had waited for 11 years. He was not being claimed. He was a conduit, a gateway. And the door was now open. Clara made a small, choked sound and stumbled back, colliding with the doorframe. Her eyes were locked on the void, drinking in the emptiness, and I saw a part of her simply break and fall away into it. She didn't scream. She just slid down the wall into a heap on the floor, her hands covering her face, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. The figure in the chair settled back. The window into the void remained, a tear in the fabric of our world, leaking its essence into the room. The cold was not of temperature, but of meaninglessness. The silence was not an absence of noise, but the end of vibration itself. Jean walked to the edge of that darkness. He did not look afraid. He looked like he was coming home. He reached out his hand, not into the void, but toward me. The command was gentle, inexorable. I took another step, then another, until I was standing beside my son at the precipice. The pull was immense, a tidal force threatening to drag my consciousness out of my body and into the stillness. I looked down at Jean. He looked up at me, and for the first time he smiled. It was a small, quiet smile, devoid of joy or malice. It was the smile of a secret finally shared. The figure in the chair did not move again. It became still, a statue of shadow and bone, a fixed point in the expanding silence. I knew then that it was not the tenant itself. It was merely the usher. The true presence was the void. The waiting was over because the waiting had arrived. It was here in the room, and it was hungry. From the hallway, I heard a new sound, cutting through the oppressive quiet. It was the high, thin wail of one of the twins, quickly muffled. The sound of a child, a real, living child, fighting against the encroaching nothing. That sound, that tiny spark of terrified life, was a pinprick of light in the overwhelming dark. I tore my gaze away from the void and looked at Clara, crumpled and broken. I looked back at the twins' door. The gravitational pull lessened, not because the void had weakened, but because I had found a counterweight. A terrible, heartbreaking choice solidified in my mind. I could step into the truth with Jean and be consumed by it, or I could turn my back on my son and try to salvage the shattered remains of my family. I reached out and took Jean S.'s small, cold hand in mine. He did not resist. He simply watched me, his dark eyes reflecting the starless black. I took a deep breath of the thin, cold air, and I made my choice. I turned away from the void, pulling Jean with me. He came without protest, his small feet shuffling on the floorboards. The figure in the chair did not react. The void did not vanish. It remained, a permanent stain on the room, a hole in our lives that would never be filled. But for now, the invitation had been declined. I led my son past his weeping mother out of the room and closed the door softly behind us. The house felt different. The waiting was indeed over. We were no longer waiting for something to happen. We were living in the aftermath. The tenant was no longer in the chair in Jean S. room. The tenant was the house itself. The days that followed were a study in gray. We moved through the rooms like ghosts, careful not to look too long at the closed door of Jean S. bedroom. We knew the void was still in there, a quiet, open mouth. We could feel its breath under the door, a constant, subtle suction that threatened to pull the warmth from the rest of the house. Clara stopped crying. She became functional, a machine of routine, making meals, cleaning surfaces, but her eyes were vacant. She had looked into the void, and a part of her had stayed there. The twins, sensing the shift, became clingy and silent. They followed me from room to room, their small hands often finding mine, as if to make sure I was still solid. They never asked about Jean. They seemed to understand, on some primal level, that he was now part of the house as silence. Jean himself was changed. The focused intensity was gone, replaced by a deep, unsettling stillness. He no longer sat in the living room or hummed that tuneless vibration. He simply existed, a quiet presence in whatever room we placed him. He would eat if food was put in front of him, sleep when led to the makeshift bed we made for him in our room. But he was no more present than a piece of furniture. The connection had been severed, or perhaps completed. The thing in the chair had gotten what it wanted from him. He was an empty vessel now. I tried to go back to work, but the world outside had lost its substance. The colors were muted, the sounds distant. My office felt like a stage set, a flimsy construction that could be blown away by the cold wind I now knew waited behind everything. I lasted 3 hours before I had to return home, drawn by a dread that was indistinguishable from relief. This house, with its silent tenant, was the only real place left. It was a Tuesday afternoon when I found Clara standing in front of the hall closet. She was just staring at the door, her head tilted. I asked her what she was doing. She didn't look at me. Her voice was a flat monotone. "The noise," she said. "It has changed." I listened. At first, I heard nothing but the usual oppressive quiet. Then I discerned it. It was no longer the sound of waiting. It was a dry, rustling sound, like old papers being slowly shuffled, or like countless insect legs moving in unison. It was coming from behind the closet door. I reached for the knob, my hand trembling. Clara didn't stop me. She just watched with those hollow eyes. I pulled the door open. There was nothing inside but coats and old shoes. But the sound was louder now, emanating from the back wall of the closet itself. I pushed the coats aside and pressed my ear against the cool plaster. The rustling was inside the wall. It was moving, downward. I ran to the kitchen and yanked open the basement door. The sound was clearer here, a soft, scraping rustle descending the wooden steps into the darkness below. I fumbled for the light switch. The single bulb flickered on, illuminating the steep staircase. I descended slowly, each step creaking under my weight. The rustling was at the bottom now. It was coming from the far corner, behind the old furnace where we stored forgotten things. I walked across the concrete floor, my heart hammering against my ribs. The sound was all around me now, a soft, insistent whisper that seemed to vibrate in my bones. I peered behind the furnace. There was nothing there but dust and a few broken picture frames. But the sound was unmistakable. It was coming from the foundation, from the very earth the house was built on. It was digging in, making itself comfortable. I climbed back up the stairs, my legs weak. Clara was still standing by the closet, but she was looking at me now. There was a faint, terrible understanding in her expression. The tenant was no longer confined to a single room. It was exploring its new home. It was in the walls. It was under the floors. The house was not just haunted. It was inhabited. And we were not the inhabitants. We were the furnishings. I knew then that we had to leave. The thought was a flare of pure, animal instinct in the gray waste of my mind. We could not stay here. We would pack a bag, take the children, and just go. We would drive until the world felt solid again. I grabbed Clara's shoulders, my voice urgent. We have to get out. Now, get the twins. ILL get Jean. She looked at me, and for a second I saw the old Clara, the fighter, flicker in her eyes. She nodded, a sharp, decisive movement, and turned toward the living room. I rushed into our bedroom where Jean sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the wall. I took his hand. It was limp and cool. "Come on, son," I said, my voice cracking. We were going for a ride. He offered no resistance as I led him into the hallway. Clara was there, holding a twin by each hand. Their small faces were pale and frightened. The rustling sound seemed to have grown, to have spread. It was a soft, chittering whisper coming from every direction at once, from behind the pictures on the walls, from under the rug. We moved as a group toward the front door. It was only 20 feet away, but it felt like a mile. The air grew thick, resistant. Each step was a struggle, as if we were wading through deep water. The rustling intensified, becoming a language of dry, scraping syllables that seemed to mock our efforts. My hand closed on the cold brass of the doorknob. I turned it. It moved freely, but the door would not budge. It was not locked. It was being held. I put my shoulder against the wood and pushed with all my strength. It felt like pushing against the side of a mountain. The door did not even shudder in its frame. From the kitchen, we heard a sharp crack, then another. We turned to see the cabinet doors swinging open, one by one. Plates and glasses began to slide from the shelves, not falling in a crash, but descending gently, silently, to arrange themselves in neat rows on the floor. A chair slid out from the table on its own, positioning itself precisely, as if for an unseen guest. The message was clear. We were not permitted to leave. The twins began to cry soft, terrified whimpers. Clara pulled them close. Jean simply stood, his head cocked as if listening to a pleasant piece of music. The rustling subsided, replaced by that same profound silence. But now it was a silence of ownership. We were trapped. The house had accepted its new tenant, and we were part of the lease. I let go of the doorknob. There was no point. We were here. This was our world now. I looked at my family, huddled together in the hallway of the house that was no longer ours, and I knew that the long, slow process of becoming furniture had truly begun. The first change was in the light. It began to fail, not with the setting of the sun, but as if a filter had been placed over every window. The vibrant green of the summer trees outside became a dull, dusty gray. The sun itself, when we could see it, was a pale, cold coin in a leaden sky. The house was sealing itself off from the outside world, stitch by stitch. We tried the phones next. The landline emitted a continuous, soft hiss, like the rustling in the walls. Our cell phones showed no signal, and when I tried to use one, the screen would flicker and display a single, shifting symbol that looked like a spiral of dust before going dark. The television offered only a shimmering, silent static. We were cut off. Days lost their meaning. We slept when we were exhausted, ate when hunger became a sharp pain, but the food from the pantry tasted of nothing. It was like chewing on chalk. Clara tried to cook a meal, but the gas stove would not light. The electric burners remained cold to the touch. Yet the house was not cold. It maintained a constant, clammy temperature, like a cellar in the summer. The twins stopped crying. They became as quiet as Jean, their bright eyes dimming. They would sit together on the living room floor, not playing, just staring at the same spot on the wall for hours. Their movements became slow, deliberate, as if they were moving through syrup. I tried to read to them from one of their picture books, but the words on the page seemed to swim and rearrange themselves into meaningless patterns. The book felt heavy, its pages thick like felt. I found Clara in the kitchen one afternoon, standing perfectly still, her hand resting on the counter. She had been there for a long time. I called her name, but she didn't respond. When I touched her shoulder, she turned her head slowly, and I saw that her pupils were wide and dark, almost swallowing the blue of her irises. There was no recognition in them, only a deep, vacant acceptance. A terrible loneliness gripped me then, more frightening than the void in Jean S. room. I was losing them. They were fading into the background of the house, becoming part of its texture. I was the only one left who remembered the before, and the memory was becoming a dream, insubstantial, and difficult to hold. I made a decision. I would go back upstairs. I would look at the void again. If this was to be our existence, I would rather face the truth than slowly dissolve into nothing. I walked to the staircase. The steps seemed steeper than before, the wood groaning with a new, tired sound. The hallway upstairs was darker, the air even thinner. The door to Jean S. room was closed. I pressed my ear against it. There was no sound, not even the rustling. There was only the silence of a vacuum. I reached for the knob. It was cold, so cold it burned my skin. I turned it. The door was unlocked. I pushed it open. The chair was still there, in the center of the room under the skylight. But the figure was gone. The void was gone. The room was utterly, completely normal. The bed was made. The toys were stacked neatly in a corner. A thin layer of dust covered everything. It was just a boy's bedroom, and that was the most horrifying thing of all. The tenant had vacated this specific room because it had no more use for it. The invitation had been made and declined. The door had been opened, and now the essence of that emptiness had spread throughout the entire structure. The house had been fully occupied. I turned to leave and saw him then. Gene was standing in the hallway, watching me. He held out his hand, not to lead me anywhere, but in a simple, childish gesture. I took it. His skin felt like old paper. He led me downstairs to the living room, where Clara and the twins were sitting motionless on the sofa. They did not look at us. Gene pulled me to my favorite armchair and gently pushed me into it. Then he climbed onto the sofa and sat between his brother and sister, placing a hand on each of their knees. I sat in the chair and watched my family. The gray light from the window began to fade into a deeper twilight. The rustling started again, but it was softer now, a comforting sound, like the settling of an old house. It was the sound of the house breathing. And as the final light died, I felt my own thoughts begin to slow, to soften at the edges. The sharp fear dulled into a vague acceptance. The memory of a world outside became a story I had once read. The chair felt familiar and solid around me. I closed my eyes. I was just another object in the room. I was home. The next awareness was not a waking, but a shifting of focus. Time had become a substance, thick and slow-moving, like dust motes in a motionless beam of light that no longer existed. I was in the chair. I had always been in the chair. My body was a part of it, the upholstery, and my skin having reached a quiet understanding. Across the room, my family was a still life. Clara, the twins, Gene. They were arranged on the sofa, their forms softened and blurred at the edges, as if they were slowly merging with the fabric. There was no need to speak. Sound was an old, forgotten concept. Communication happened through a different medium now, a gentle pressure in the air, a shared stillness. We were aware of the tenant. It was not a presence you felt in a single location. It was the air itself, the subtle groan of a floorboard, the slow, inevitable path of a crack forming in the ceiling plaster. It was the quiet satisfaction of a structure settling into its final, permanent form. We were part of its contentment. Sometimes a memory would surface, a sharp, bright shard from the before time. The taste of an orange, the sound of rain on a tin roof, the feeling of wind. These memories were like small, painful lights flickering in the vast, comfortable dark. They were disruptions, and the house would soothe them away. A gentle rustle would move through the walls, a wave of calming silence that would wash over the memory until it faded, leaving only a smooth, gray piece. watched a spider weave a web in the corner of the window, its movements precise and unhurried. It was not an intruder. It was part of the decor. A fly became entangled, its buzzing a brief, frantic violation of the quiet. The spider moved in, and the buzzing ceased. Balance was restored. This was the way of things. Jean was the most settled of us all. He had been the first to understand. He would sometimes turn his head, his dark eyes meeting mine across the room. There was no message in them, no emotion. It was simply acknowledgement of shared existence. He was the reason we were here, and he was the reason we were at peace. He had brought the tenant home, and the tenant had accepted us as part of the package. One day, or perhaps it was night, the front door swung open. It did not bang against the wall. It simply drifted inward, silent on its hinges. A man stood there, silhouetted against the gray nothingness of the outside. He was a postal worker, his uniform a faded blue smudge. He held a bundle of letters. He took a step inside, his face confused. He called out a hello, his voice a hollow, alien echo in the absorbed silence of the house. He looked around, his eyes trying to adjust to the dimness. He saw us. He saw me in the chair, my family on the sofa. We did not move. We simply were. A look of profound unease crossed his face. He took a step back, his boots scuffing against the floorboards. The sound was jarring, an offense. He dropped the letters on the small table by the door. His eyes darted around, seeing the dust, the stillness, the way the light seemed to die before it reached the corners of the room. He saw the spiderweb, now thick and layered, covering the entire window. He muttered an apology and retreated, pulling the door closed behind him. The latch clicked into place. The brief disturbance was over. The house absorbed the echo of his footsteps, the scent of the outside air he had brought in with him. The silence seeped back, richer and deeper than before. The letters on the table yellowed at the edges, then faded to the same uniform gray as everything else. I felt a final, fleeting pang of something pity, perhaps, for the man who had to go back out into that chaotic, noisy world. Then it passed. The rustling in the walls was a soft, approving hum. We were safe. We were home. We were part of the house, and the house was eternal. There was nothing else to want. Story 3. The house on Hemlock Lane was a good house. Kala told herself this every morning as she measured the coffee, as she watched the steam fog the window over the sink, as she traced the familiar grain of the oak floorboards with her socked feet. It was a house built of sturdy brick and quiet intentions, a house that held the light in a particular way in the afternoons, painting long, languid rectangles of gold across the living room rug. It was a house that smelled of lemon polish and the yeasty warmth of Brian S. bread. A house where the locks clicked shut with a sound of finality that was meant to be a comfort. But sometimes, in the liminal space between sleep and waking, Kala would open her eyes and the room would be wrong. Not dramatically, not with a monster in the corner, but subtly, insidiously. door to the hallway, which she always closed tight against the night, would be open a precise 3 inches, a sliver of darkness that felt like a held breath, or the pattern of the quilt on her and Brian S. bed, a wedding gift from the church ladies, would seem to writhe for a moment, the familiar roses twisting into shapes that suggested teeth or desperate, open mouths. It was a fleeting thing, a trick of the light or a remnant of a dream, but it left a cold knot in her stomach that took hours to dissolve. It was the feeling of a seam coming undone, a thread pulled loose from the tapestry of her hard-won peace. Her daughter, London, named for a city Kala had only seen in a tattered magazine, was the anchor that held her fast against these tremors. At 17, London was all sharp angles and soft contradictions, her laughter too loud for the quiet house, her headphones a permanent barrier against a world she found too demanding. She was the future, Kala thought, a future built on this placid Midwestern street, a future where the past was a country you had left and would never, ever revisit. Brian was the foundation. A large, quiet man with carpenter-esque hands that could be both brute strong and impossibly gentle. He had found Kala when she was little more than a ghost herself, newly emerged from the shadows of a life she refused to discuss. He had built this house around her, board by board, nail by nail, and in doing so, he had built a container for her soul. He never asked for the whole story. He seemed to understand that some stories are like black holes. To speak them is to risk being pulled back into their gravity. The first true omen arrived on a Tuesday, disguised as a letter. It was not addressed to Kala, but to Brian, from a law firm in a state she had not heard from in 18 years. It concerned the estate of a woman named Cora Villers. The name meant nothing to Brian, who shrugged his broad shoulders and set the letter aside. But to Kala, it was a key turning in a lock she had sealed with rust and prayer. Cora Villers was the name of the mistress of the house, the great white house with the columns that stood at the end of a long, cruel lane, a house whose very dust was made of sorrow. She said nothing. She folded the terror away and tucked it deep inside, a secret shard of ice next to her heart. But the house felt different after that. The floorboards creaked with a new, knowing tone. The wind whistling through the screens carried a faint, discordant melody, like a music box playing underwater. Then the girl came. It was a rain-soaked evening, the sky the color of bruised plum. Brian was out late on a job, and London was upstairs, the thrum of her music a distant heartbeat through the ceiling. Kala was darning a sock, a domestic act that felt suddenly fragile and absurd when a knock came at the door. Not a confident rap, but a series of light, hesitant taps, like a bird beating its wings against the glass. Through the peephole, the world was distorted into a fisheye lens. A figure stood on the porch, drenched, a small suitcase at her feet. A young woman, her face pale and drawn under the porch light. Something in the slope of her shoulders, in the way she held her head, sent a jolt of pure animal recognition through Kala. It was a memory from a fever dream from a forgotten room. She opened the door, the chain still on. The damp air rushed in, smelling of wet earth and decay. "Yes," Kala said, her voice tight. The girl looked up. Her eyes were the color of dark honey, and they held a depth that belied her youth. She couldn't have been more than 20. "I am looking for Kala," the girl said. Her voice was soft, with a lilt that was unmistakably from the low country, a cadence Kala had worked for 2 decades to erase from her own tongue. "Who are you?" "My name is London," the girl said. The world tilted. Kala gripped the doorframe. It was not possible. It was a cruel joke, a coincidence of the most vicious kind. She had named her daughter London for its distance, for its foreignness. To hear that name spoken back to her in that accent was a violation. "What do you want?" Kala whispered. "Cora Villers was my grandmother," the girl said, her gaze steady, unblinking. "She told me before she passed that if I ever needed anything, I should come find you. She said you owed her a debt." The words hung in the air between them, toxic and heavy. The debt. It was not a thing of money. It was a thing of blood and silence, a thing Kala had carried with her every day of her freedom. She wanted to slam the door, to lock it, to push the world away. But the girl's eyes held her, and in them she saw the ghost of the big house, the shadow of the live oaks, the reflection of a self she had buried. Against every screaming instinct, Kala slid the chain free and opened the door. The girl, London, moved through the house on Hemlock Lane like a whisper. She was endlessly polite, unnervingly quiet. She ate the food they gave her with a delicate gratitude. She thanked Brian for the towel. She complimented the solidness of the furniture he had built. But her presence was a slow poison in the water of their lives. The younger London was fascinated and repelled. She would watch the stranger from the staircase, her own name now feeling borrowed and strange on her lips. "Why is she here?" she demanded of her mother one night, her voice a hissed whisper in the kitchen. "She gives me the creeps. She just sits and stares." Kala could offer no answer that would make sense. How could she explain that this girl was a walking wound, a living reminder of a time when she was not a mother, not a wife, not a free woman, but a creature of survival, capable of things that still haunted the hollows of her bones? The 2 Londons existed in a tense orbit. The elder London, the visitor, would sometimes hum a tune, an old spiritual that Kala had not heard since childhood. It was a song about crossing over, about a river and a promised land. When she hummed it, the air in the house would grow thick and cold, and Kala would feel a phantom pain in her back, the memory of a lash. Brian sensed the shift. He watched Kala retreat into a shell of silence, her eyes darting toward the guest room door as if expecting it to open at any moment. "That girl's trouble, Kala," he said one night in the privacy of their bedroom, his voice low and worried. "She's got a shadow on her. We can give her some money, put her on a bus. You don't owe these people anything." But he was wrong. The debt was not to Cora Villers. The debt was to the past itself, and the past had sent its collector. Days bled into weeks. The omens accumulated like dust. Kala began to find things misplaced. A kitchen knife left on the porch railing, its blade speckled with rust that looked like old blood. A single, long, dark hair coiled on her daughter's pillow. And the dreams returned, not as vague anxieties, but as vivid, suffocating replays. The heat of the cotton fields, the weight of the iron in the laundry house, the sound of a man's boot heels on the veranda, and always the other child, the little girl with the honey-colored eyes who would sneak her scraps of bread, the child who belonged to the house but was as trapped within it as Kala was. Her name had been Essie. One evening, Kala could bear it no longer. She found the elder London sitting on the back steps, staring out at the darkening yard. The scent of jasmine from a neighbor's fence was cloyingly sweet in the air. Essie, Kala said. The name of forbidden stone dropped into the stillness. The girl turned her head slowly. A faint, knowing smile touched her lips. No one has called me that in a very long time. What do you want from me? Kala's voice was raw. Essie, who now called herself London, looked back at the yard. I remember when you left, she said, her voice dreamy, distant. It was the night of the great fire in the sugar cane. The sky was orange. Everyone was running. You took the chance. You just disappeared into the dark. She paused, and the silence was heavier than any confession. You didn't take me with you. The accusation was not spoken in anger, but with a flat, terrible finality. It was the revelation Kala had been running from for half her life. The unbearable guilt was not just for surviving, but for leaving behind a piece of her soul. Essie, the master's daughter by one of the field hands, a child who was neither family nor slave, a child Kala had protected, had loved as a sister. And when the moment of escape came, a moment of pure, blind panic, Kala had run alone. I couldn't Kala whispered, the words tearing at her throat. There was no time. You were my only friend, Essie said, turning her honey-colored eyes back to Kala. They were no longer the eyes of a girl, but of something ancient and wounded. You were all I had, and you left me there, with her. The climax did not arrive with a scream or specter. It arrived with a simple request. Essie asked to braid Kala's hair. It was something she had done as a child, sitting between Kala's knees in a dusty corner of the yard, her small fingers deftly weaving the thick strands. Now, in the lamplight of the living room, with Brian and the younger London watching a movie down the hall, Kala sat on the floor and felt the woman's hands in her hair. It was an intimate, terrifying act. Each touch was a thread pulling her back. The scent of Essie's skin was different now, but underneath the soap, Kala could smell the old smells, the hot earth, the honeysuckle that grew by the slave quarters, the faint, metallic scent of the river. Essie's fingers moved slowly, deliberately, and as she braided, she began to whisper, not in her own voice, but in the voices of the past. She whispered with the cracked, weary tone of old Joseph, who died in the fields. She murmured with the light, singing voice of Sarah, who drowned herself in the river. She spoke with the cold, imperious voice of Cora Villers. It was not possession. It was an excavation. Essie was a living conduit, a well of memory, and she was pouring all of it into Kala through the simple, brutal intimacy of her touch. The weight of generations, the trauma of 100 souls, settled onto Kala S. shoulders. She saw it all not as a memory, but as a present reality. The whippings, the births, the deaths, the silent, hateful meals in the big house, the desperate, furtive moments of love and kindness. It was all inside Essie. And now, it was all inside Kala again. When Essie was finished, she tied the braid with a piece of string and leaned close to Kala S. ear. "You can outrun it," she whispered, her own voice returning, filled with a profound and weary sorrow. "You can build 1,000 houses, but the past is the ground they rebuilt on. I am not here for revenge, Kala. I am here to remind you of what you are. We are the remembering." Kala did not sleep that night. She sat by her daughter S. bed, watching the rise and fall of the younger London S. breath. This child of the future, who knew nothing of the terrible weight of history. She looked at Ryan, sleeping the untroubled sleep of a man who believed the world could be fixed with strong hands and a good heart. She knew then that the haunting was not external. It was not a ghost in the hallway. The haunting was the inheritance of memory, the generational trauma that lived in the blood. A curse that could not be broken, only carried. In the morning, Essie was gone. Her small suitcase was gone. The guest room was pristine, as if she had never been there. But her presence remained, a stain on the air, a silence that was louder than any sound. Kala tried to return to normality. She made coffee. She watched the steam fog the window. But the house on Hemlock Lane was no longer a good house. It was just a structure of wood and brick, a fragile shelter against a truth that was too vast and too dark to be contained. The piece she had built was revealed as an illusion, a beautiful, desperate lie. A week later, a letter came for the younger London. A college acceptance from a school on the West Coast, as far from the past as it was possible to get. The girl was overjoyed, her fears about the strange visitor forgotten in the bright promise of the future. Kala helped her pack. She folded her daughter S. clothes with a meticulous care, each garment a relic from a life that was now ending. On the day of departure, she stood with Brian on the porch, watching as London loaded the last box into her beat-up car. The sun was shining. The neighborhood was quiet. London hugged Brian, her tears bright and happy. Then she turned to Kala. "I'll call when I get there, Mom. I love you." Kala held her daughter tight, breathing in the scent of her shampoo, feeling the vibrant, impatient life in her limbs. She wanted to say something, to warn her, to give her a weapon against the darkness that would inevitably find her, too. But there were no words for such a thing. All she could do was pour all her love, all her fear, all her hope into that single embrace. "I love you, London," she said. "Be safe." She watched her daughter drive away, the car growing smaller and smaller until it turned the corner and was gone. Brian put a heavy, comforting arm around her shoulders. "She'll be fine," he said. "We'll be fine. It's just you and me again." Kala nodded but said nothing. She stood there for a long time, watching the empty street. Then she turned and walked back into the house. She went to the bedroom and opened her closet. From the very back, she pulled out a small, worn satchel. She did not pack much: a change of clothes, a photograph of London as a baby. The rest was just weight. Brian was in the kitchen, washing the breakfast dishes. He heard her footsteps on the stairs. "Kala, you okay?" She did not answer. She walked through the living room, her hand brushing the back of the sofa. A final, fleeting touch. She opened the front door and stepped out onto the porch. The afternoon light was long and golden, just as it had been on 1,000 other afternoons. She did not look back at the house. She did not look toward the kitchen window where she knew Brian would be watching, his face creased with confusion and dawning horror. She simply walked down the steps and onto the path. She walked to the end of Hemlock Lane, her stride steady and sure. She turned onto the larger road, where the cars whispered past, heading to places unknown. She walked away from the life she had built, not in fear, but in a terrible, clear-eyed acceptance. The past had not come to destroy her home. It had come to remind her that she never had one to begin with. She was a story, and the story was not finished. The debt was not paid in safety and silence. It was paid in remembrance. And so Kala walked, a solitary figure growing smaller and smaller against the vast, indifferent landscape, carrying the whole terrible, beautiful weight of it all, moving toward the horizon, never once looking back. The road was rough under her thin-soled shoes, a sensation she had not felt in 20 years. Each pebble was a memory. The sun, warm on her neck, was the same sun that had beaten down on the fields. She walked without a destination, her body moving on an instinct older than the name Kala. She was S.E.S. Kala again, the girl who could walk for miles on blistered feet, who knew how to find water in the crooked elbow of a creek, who understood the language of the stars, not as constellations, but as guides. Cars slowed, their drivers offering concerned looks or tentative offers of a ride. She ignored them, her eyes fixed on the seam where the asphalt met the sky. She was a ghost walking in reverse, shedding the skin of the wife, the mother, the neighbor, until only the raw nerve of the past remained. Brian would be frantic by now. He would have called London, who would be angry and terrified, speeding back toward a home that was already empty. Kala felt a pang of grief so sharp it doubled her over for a moment, her hand pressed against a rough fence post. But the grief was not for them, not exactly. It was for the beautiful lie she had let them believe, the lie that she was whole. As dusk began to bleed into the sky, she found herself at a crossroads. One sign pointed toward the interstate, the other toward a town she had never heard of. A truck, old and rusted, was idling at the stop sign. The driver, a man with a face like worn leather, rolled down his window. "You look lost," he said, his voice a low rumble. "I'm not lost," Kala said, and the truth of it was absolute. For the first time in decades, she knew exactly where she was. She was in the story. "Where you headed?" the man asked, not unkindly. "South," she said. It was the only direction that existed. He nodded slowly, as if this made perfect sense. "I'm going south a piece. Got a load of lumber to drop in Cairo. Can take you as far as the river." The river. The word was a key turning in a lock deep inside her. She nodded and walked around to the passenger side, pulling herself up into the cab. The truck smelled of diesel and old tobacco. She closed the door, and the man put the truck in gear. They pulled away from the crossroads, leaving Hemlock Lane, and everything it represented behind them in the gathering dark. They did not speak. The man seemed to understand that words were not what she needed. He drove, and Kala watched the world change outside the window. The neat, ordered fields of the Midwest gave way to a different landscape, one of thicker woods and a heavier, wetter air. She slept fitfully, her head against the cool glass, and dreamed of Essie not as a woman, but as the child she had been, her small hand tucked securely in Kala's. They reached the great river just after dawn. The water was wide and brown, swirling with secrets. The man led her out at a truck stop on the Illinois side. "You sure about this?" he asked, his eyes searching her face. Kala just thanked him and slid out of the cab. The air here was different. It tasted of silt and old rain. She used the last of the money she had taken from the coffee can in the kitchen to buy a bus ticket. The destination was a small town just north of the Louisiana border, a place whose name she had seen on the return address of Cora Villers's letter to Brian. It was the closest she could get without stepping directly onto the soil that had bred her. The bus ride was a descent. Each mile south was a layer of time peeling away. The voices around her began to soften into the familiar cadence of her childhood. The faces held echoes of faces she had known. She got off the bus in a town that was little more than a gas station and a diner. The heat was a physical weight, a blanket of humidity she had forgotten could exist. She stood for a moment, disoriented, the satchel heavy in her hand. She walked away from the main road, down a smaller one that turned to gravel, then to dirt. The live oaks appeared first, their branches draped with ghostly Spanish moss. The sound of cicadas was a deafening roar, a sound that had been the backdrop to every moment of her youth. She walked until her feet ached and the blisters broke, until the sun was high and hot overhead, and then she saw it. Not the great house itself, but what remained of it. At the end of the overgrown lane, flanked by the gnarled and ancient oaks, stood the ruins of the Villers plantation. The white columns were blackened and crumbling, the roof long gone. The sugar cane fields had been reclaimed by scrub pine and kudzu. It was a skeleton, a monument to decay. Kala did not approach the main house. Instead, she turned toward a cluster of smaller, even more dilapidated structures nearly hidden in the woods. The slave quarters. The roofs had caved in. The walls were little more than piles of rotten timber and rusted tin. But one, at the very end, was still partially standing. She pushed aside a curtain of vines and stepped inside. The dirt floor was cool and damp. The air was thick with the smell of mold and memory. In the corner, where two walls still met, was a small, blackened hearth. She knelt before it, her knees cracking on the hard earth. She reached a hand into the hearth, her fingers brushing against soot that was decades old. She dug, just a little, her nails scraping against a stone that felt loose. She pried it up. Underneath, wrapped in oilcloth that was brittle and falling apart, was a small, carved bird, a whippoorwill made of dark wood. She had hidden it there the night she ran, a final, childish act of defiance, a piece of herself she could leave behind because it was too precious to carry on a desperate journey. She held the bird in her palm. It was lighter than she remembered. Essie must have known it was here. She must have come back, too. This was not an accusation. It was an invitation. A summons to remember not just the pain, but the girl who had endured it, the girl who had carved this bird from a piece of driftwood, the girl who had loved and been loved in this very spot. Kala sat back on her heels, the wooden bird clutched in her hand. She looked out through the broken wall at the decaying world outside. She had spent a lifetime building a house to keep the past out. But the past was not a thing to be kept out. It was the ground. It was the air. It was the blood in her veins. Essie had not come for revenge. She had come to bring her home, not to a place, but to herself. And as the first tears finally came, hot and silent in the ruined little house, Kala knew the work was only beginning. The remembering had to be done, and she was finally ready to begin. The silence of the ruins was a living thing. It was not the quiet of Hemlock Lane, a silence padded with comfort and the hum of appliances. This was a thick, heavy silence, broken only by the rustle of some small creature in the leaves and the distant, lonely cry of a bird. Kala did not move from the dirt floor of the cabin for a long time. The carved bird felt warm in her hand, as if it had been waiting for her all these years, storing the sun-s heat just for this moment. She thought of London, her London, speeding toward an empty house. She thought of Brian-s face, the trust in it shattered. The pain was a clean cut, sharp and deep, but it was a pain she had to carry, just like all the rest. To stay would have been a slower, more insidious death for all of them. The ghost she had tried to bury would have haunted her daughter-s life, a legacy of unspoken sorrow. Now, at least, the haunting was contained within her. As the afternoon light began to soften, she knew she could not stay in the ruins. The past was here, but it was not a place to live. It was a place to reckon. She stood, her body stiff and protesting, and tucked the wooden bird into the pocket of her pants. She pushed back through the vines and stood looking at the skeleton of the big house. The grand staircase, now a crumbling slope of brick, led to nothing but sky. A voice, thin and reedy, cut through the heavy air. Ain't nothing left to see up there. Just hornets and memories. Kala turned. An old man stood at the edge of the clearing, leaning on a gnarled walking stick. His skin was as dark and weathered as the oak trees, his back bent with age. He was watching her with a calm, unsurprised expression. I didn't think anyone would be here, Kala said, her voice sounding strange to her own ears. Oh, I am always here, the man said. He gestured with his stick toward a narrow path Kala hadn't noticed. My place is just yonder. Been keeping an eye on things. Waiting, I suppose. Waiting for what? For one of you to come back. He started down the path, not looking to see if she followed. After a moment's hesitation, Kala did. His cabin was small but sturdy, set back in a grove of pines. Smoke curled from a stone chimney. Inside, it was tidy and spare. He motioned for her to sit at a rough-hewn table and poured her a cup of water from a clay pitcher. You got the look, he said, sitting opposite her. The Villar's look, around the eyes. I was born here, Kala said. It was the first time she had spoken those words aloud in a lifetime. I know, the old man said. My name is Isaiah. My grandmother was a cook in the big house. My daddy, he worked the fields until he dropped. I was born here too. Stayed on as caretaker long after the family was gone. Didn't he have nowhere else to go? Kala looked at him, this living piece of the past. Did you know a girl named Essie? Isaiah's eyes clouded for a moment, then cleared. The mixed child, Korah's daughter. Yes, I knew her. A quiet little thing. She left long time ago, after the fire. He studied Kala's face. You Ray the other one, the one who ran first. The way he said it held no judgment. It was simply a fact, a line in a story he knew by heart. Kala felt a sob rise in her throat, but she swallowed it down. She found me. Essie found me. Isaiah nodded slowly. She said she would. She came back here. Oh, must be 10 years ago now. Stood right where you were standing. She said she had to find you to finish the story. He took a sip of his water, said you both carried half of a song, and it wouldn't be right until you sang it together. Where is she now? Kala asked, her heart pounding. Gone, Isaiah said softly. Passed on, 2 winters back. She's buried in the colored cemetery over in Milltown. She came back here to die. Said this was the only ground that knew her true name. Kala bowed her head. She had come all this way, and Essie was gone. The reunion she had both feared and longed for would never happen. The grief was a fresh wave, threatening to pull her under. Don't you see, child? Isaiah said, his voice gentle. She didn't send you here for her. She sent you here for you. The song ain't about singing it together. It's about you learning your own part. He pointed a bony finger toward the ruins. The story in the ground, in the stones. It's in you. Essie's work was to bring you back to it. The rest of the work is yours alone. He stood up, and went to a small chest in the corner. He came back with a faded, leather-bound journal. "She left this for you. Said if you ever came, I was to give it to you." Kala took the journal with trembling hands. She opened it. The pages were filled with SES elegant, looping script. It was not a story of anger or accusation. It was a record. The names of the people who had lived and died on this land. Their joys and their sorrows. The recipes her mother had whispered to her. The songs sung in the fields. The story of the night Kala ran away, written not with bitterness, but with a heartbreaking understanding. Essie had become the keeper of the memories, and now she was passing the duty to Kala. Kala looked up at Isaiah, tears streaming freely down her face now. "What do I do?" "You stay," he said simply. "For a little while. You listen. You remember. And then you live. You carry it all, not as a burden, but as a truth. That S, the only way the song gets passed on. That S, the only way it ever gets easier for the ones who come after." That night, Kala slept on a cot in the corner of Isaiah's cabin. For the first time in weeks, she did not dream of the past. She simply slept, exhausted and hollowed out. The next morning, she walked back to the ruins with SES journal in her hand. She sat on the steps of the big house, the same steps where Cora Villers had once held court, and she began to read. She read the names aloud into the still, morning air. Joseph, Sarah, Benjamin, Essie, Kala. She spoke them into the world, a litany of remembrance. It was not an end to the haunting. It was an invitation for the ghosts to finally speak, and for the first time, she was ready to listen. The sun climbed higher, burning away the morning mist. The names on the page began to blur, not from tears, but from a dawning recognition. These were not just names, they were a map of her own blood. Essie had drawn lines connecting them, notes in the margins. Joseph, carpenter, Sarah's father, taught Essie to whittle. Kala's fingers went to the wooden bird in her pocket. She had always thought she'd carved it herself, a solitary act of creation. But the memory, faint and shimmering, surfaced now. A man's rough hands guiding her small ones, the scent of pine shavings, a deep, patient voice. Joseph. A car engine coughed and sputtered in the distance, a sound that did not belong. Kala closed the journal and stood up, her body stiff. She watched the dirt lane, the one she had walked down yesterday. A cloud of red dust appeared, and then a sheriff's department cruiser, moving slowly over the ruts. It came to a stop near Isaiah's cabin. 2 deputies got out, their uniforms crisp and alien against the decaying landscape. One was young, his hand resting on his belt. The other was older, his face set in lines of weary duty. Isaiah emerged from his cabin, nodding to them. They spoke for a moment. Then, the older deputy looked toward the ruins, toward her. He started walking over, his boots crunching on the gravel and broken brick. "Ma'am," he called out when he was still a dozen yards away. "Are you Kala Jenkins?" She did not correct him. Jenkins was Brian's name, the name she had taken. It felt like a costume now. "I am." The deputy stopped a respectful distance away, his eyes taking in the journal in her hand, her worn clothes, the profound stillness that surrounded her. "We've had a missing persons report filed out of Illinois. A Brian Jenkins is very worried about you." He said the words gently, as if speaking to a spooked animal. Kala looked past him, toward the cruiser, toward the road that led back to a world of kitchens and coffee cans and neatly mowed lawns. "I'm not missing," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "You can tell him I am exactly where I need to be." The deputy shifted his weight. "Ma'am, he said you left without any explanation. He's concerned for your welfare. We're obligated to make sure you're safe and of sound mind." A sound, something between a laugh and a sob, escaped her. Sound mind. What was a sound mind after a lifetime of silence? "My mind has never been clearer, deputy." She looked him directly in the eye. "Tell Brian I am safe. Tell him I am sorry for the pain, but I am not coming back. The life I had with him, it was real, and it was good. But it's over." The younger deputy had wandered over to the crumbling quarters, peering into the dark doorway of the cabin where she had found the bird. He looked uneasy, out of his depth. The older man studied her face for a long moment. He saw the resolve there, the deep, unshakable certainty. This was not a case of confusion or dementia. This was a choice. "Are you staying here?" he asked, gesturing vaguely at the ruins. "For now." "With him," she said, nodding toward Isaiah, who stood watching from his porch. "I have family here." The deputy seemed to accept this. He tipped his hat. "I'll relay your message, ma'am, but he may not understand." "I know," Kala said. "That's not my burden anymore." She watched them get back into their cruiser and turn around, heading back down the lane, taking the ghost of her old life with them. She felt a final, quiet severing. There would be more phone calls, perhaps. London might come, but she would not be moved. She had been found, but not by them. She had been found by herself. Isaiah walked over to her, his steps slow and measured. "Trouble past," he stated. "It never stays gone for long," Kala replied, but without fear. It was simply a fact. "That's true," he said, "but you learn to meet it on different ground." He looked toward the overgrown fields. The ground needs tending, even if it's just to remember what once grew here. Kala followed his gaze. The kudzu was thick, but beneath it, she could see the faint, straight lines of old furrows. The past was not just a story to be read. It was a field to be cleared. It was hard, physical work. The kind of work that could break you open and put you back together. "Where would I start?" she asked. Isaiah handed her a rusty sickle that was leaning against a fallen column. "Anywhere," he said. "You just start cutting. The land will tell you the rest." Kala took the sickle. The handle was smooth from generations of use. She walked to the edge of the field where the weeds were tallest. She swung the blade, feeling the resistance of the thick vines, the satisfying snap as they gave way. The sun was hot on her back. The cicadas screamed their ancient song. With each swing, she felt a layer of the woman named Kala Jenkins fall away. She was not building a new life. She was uncovering the one that had been waiting for her all along. The work was beginning. The sickle was heavy in her hand, an unfamiliar weight that quickly made her palm ache and her shoulder burn. She was not used to this labor. Her muscles, softened by years of domestic life, protested with every swing. But the pain was honest. It was a feeling located firmly in the present, a counterpoint to the vast, echoing pain of the past. She worked until her breath came in ragged gasps, and sweat stung her eyes, clearing a small, ragged patch of earth. When she could swing the blade no more, she dropped it and sat on the ground, her back against a surviving section of the big house S foundation. The sun was directly overhead. Isaiah brought her a tin cup of water. She drank it greedily, the warm water tasting better than anything she had ever had. "You'll get used to it," he said, not unkindly. "Or you one tea some folks ain't tea meant for this kind of remembering." "I am," Kala said, the words a vow. She looked at her raw, blistered hands. They were no longer the hands of a mother who packed school lunches and weeded a flower garden. They were becoming something else. In the days that followed, a new rhythm established itself. She woke with the sun in the small cot in Isaiah's cabin. She helped him with his simple chores, drawing water from the well, tending the small vegetable patch behind his house. Then she would return to the ruins. Some days she worked with the sickle, clearing the land foot by foot. Other days she simply sat with Essie's journal, reading and rereading the entries, letting the stories settle inside her. She learned about the people she had known only as shadows. She learned about her own mother, a woman named Lena, who had a voice so beautiful it could make the field hands stop their work to listen. She had died of a fever when Kala was too young to remember her clearly. Essie had written down a song she used to sing, a lullaby. Kala found herself humming the melody as she worked, the notes feeling both strange and familiar on her tongue. One afternoon, a week after the deputies had come, a different car made its way down the lane. It was an old, dust-covered sedan. A woman got out, tall and slender, with skin the color of rich coffee and eyes that held a familiar, penetrating calm. She carried a large basket covered with a cloth. Isaiah nodded to her from his porch. "Afternoon, Marie," Isaiah, the woman said. Then her gaze found Kala, who was standing near the slave quarters, the sickle hanging limp at her side. The woman walked toward her, her steps sure on the uneven ground. "You must be Kala," she said. Her voice was low and melodic. "I am Marie Thibodeaux. Essie was my aunt." The air left Kala's lungs. She looked at Marie, seeing the echo of Essie in the shape of her mouth, the intelligence in her eyes. I didn't he know she had family so close. "Most folks didn't he," Marie said. She kept to herself, but she talked about you. She said one day you'd come back, and when you did, I was to bring you this. She held out the basket. Kala took it, setting it on a nearby stone. She lifted the cloth. Inside were loaves of dark bread, a jar of preserves, a bundle of greens, simple, sustaining food. But at the bottom of the basket, wrapped in a piece of soft linen, was a photograph. It was faded and cracked, but the image was clear. Two little girls, one light-skinned, one dark, sitting on the steps of a cabin. Their heads were tilted together, and they were laughing. It was Essie and Kala. Kala traced the image with a trembling finger. She had no memory of the picture being taken. She had no memory of ever laughing like that with Essie. The past she had constructed was one of singular loneliness. But here was proof. There had been love. There had been connection. She wanted you to have that, Marie said softly. She said you might need a reminder that not everything that grew here was bitter. Kala looked from the photograph to Marie's face. "Thank you," she whispered, the words inadequate. Marie stayed for an hour. They did not speak of painful things. They spoke of the weather, of the stubbornness of kudzu, of the way the light fell through the oaks in the late afternoon. It was the easy, meandering talk of family. When Marie left, she squeezed Kala's hand. "You're welcome at my table anytime. We look after our own." Kala watched the car disappear, the dust settling back onto the lane. She held the photograph in her hand. She was not alone. The story was not just in the journal or in the ground. It was living and breathing in the people who had stayed, who had remembered. The work was not just about cutting back the past. It was about tending what remained, what had survived. She picked up the sickle again, her blisters now hardened into calluses. She had a family to look after. She had a song to learn. She turned back to the field, ready to continue. The calluses on her hands were kind of armor now. Each evening, as the fireflies began their silent, blinking dance over the cleared patches of earth, Kala would sit on Isaiah's porch and examine them by the light of the kerosene lamp. They were a map of her new life, a testament to the work of remembering. Isaiah taught her how to rub them with a salve made from pine sap and beeswax, a recipe Essie had written down in her journal. The days began to blend, marked not by hours on a clock, but by the sun's arc and the progress of her labor. She uncovered more than just dirt. One morning, her sickle clinked against something hard and metallic. She knelt and dug with her hands, pulling free a heavy, rusted iron pot. Isaiah identified it as a wash pot, used by generations of women. Kala cleaned it carefully and placed it near the foundation of the big house, a solid, silent monument. She started a garden. It was a small, defiant act of life in a place of death. Marie brought her seeds collard greens, okra, tomatoes, the same crops that had always been grown on this land. Kala planted them in the soil she had cleared, her hands burying the seeds with a reverence that felt like prayer. She imagined Essie's mother, Cora, doing the same thing, tending a patch of earth to feed her family. The past was no longer a ghost that haunted her. It was a companion that walked beside her. She found herself talking to Essie as she worked, telling her about the progress of the okra, about the pair of bluebirds that had nested in the eaves of Isaiah's cabin. It was not a crazy person's monologue, but a quiet, ongoing conversation with a sister. One afternoon, a letter arrived, forwarded from Illinois. It was from Brian. Isaiah handed it to her without a word, his expression neutral. Kala took it to her favorite spot on the crumbling steps and slit the envelope with her thumbnail. The letter was long, full of pain and confusion and a desperate, pleading logic. He wrote about London's tears, about the empty space in their bed, about the life they had built together. He asked her what he had done wrong. He begged her to come home. She read it twice, each word a small, sharp stone dropped into the quiet pool of her new existence. The guilt was a physical pressure in her chest. She had caused this pain. The life she had left behind had been real, and the people in it were suffering because of her choice. For a moment, the old urge to run flickered within her. It would be so easy to get in the car, to drive back to Illinois, to slip back into the comfortable, numb skin of Kala Jenkins. She could apologize, explain it away as a temporary breakdown, and resume her life. The thought was seductive in its simplicity, but as she sat there, the sun warm on her shoulders, she heard the distant cry of a hawk. She looked down at her hands, at the dirt ingrained in the lines of her palms. She looked at the garden, the tiny green shoots pushing bravely through the dark soil. She thought of the photograph of her and Essie, two little girls who belonged to this earth. She went inside the cabin and found a pen and a sheet of paper. She did not write a long letter. She did not try to explain the unexplainable. She wrote only a few lines. Brian, I am safe. I am home. The life we had was a good one, and I will always be grateful for it. But it was not my true life. Please tell London I love her. Please try to understand that I had to choose to live, or I would have simply ceased to exist. Kala. She mailed the letter the next time Marie visited. She felt a final, quiet click, like a lock turning. She had closed the door on one world and opened another. That night, as she sat on the porch with Isaiah, a strange sound echoed from the direction of the ruins. It was a low, mournful wail, like an animal in distress. Kala stiffened, her heart jumping. Isaiah, however, did not look up from whittling a piece of wood. What was that? Kala asked. The wind, Isaiah said calmly. It gets caught in what's left of the big house chimney. Sounds like a woman crying, Don Tiet. Scared me half to death when I was a boy. Kala listened. The sound came again, a lonely, keening note. But now that she knew its source, the fear evaporated, replaced by a deep, aching sadness. It was just the wind. It was always just the wind, giving voice to the grief that had soaked into the land. It has a sad sound, she said. It is, Isaiah agreed. But it's just air moving. It can hurt you. You learn the difference between a ghost and the wind, and you can live with both. Kala nodded, understanding. She was learning the difference. The ghosts were in Essie's journal, in the photograph, in the rusted wash pot. They were memories to be honored. The crying on the wind was just noise. It was the sound of a broken place, and she was no longer broken. She was whole enough to listen without being afraid. She was whole enough to begin to heal the land, and in doing so, to heal herself. The long silence was over. The next morning, the air was thick with the promise of rain. Kala worked with a new urgency, pulling weeds from around the tender tomato plants before the storm could wash away the loose soil. The physical labor had become a meditation, her mind quiet and focused on the simple tasks of her hands. As she worked, a truck she didn't recognize rattled down the lane. It was an old Ford, painted a faded blue. It stopped near Isaiah's cabin, and a man with a kind, weathered face got out. He carried a toolbox. Isaiah walked out to meet him, and they spoke for a moment before both men looked toward Kala. Isaiah waved her over. "Kala, this is Eli," Isaiah said. "He is a carpenter. Does good work." Eli tipped his hat. "Isaiah tells me you are staying. Said the roof on that old cabin by the quarters ain't fit for a dog." He gestured with his chin toward the small structure where she had found the bird. "I've got some spare tin in my truck. Could patch it up for you, make it dry." Kala looked from Eli's honest face to the cabin. The idea had not even occurred to her. She had been sleeping in Isaiah's cabin, a temporary guest. But this offer felt different. It felt like a foundation. "I don't have much money," she said, the practical concerns of her old life surfacing for a moment. Eli shook his head. "Marie Thibodeaux is my cousin. We don't worry about that right now. A body needs a solid roof. We can settle up later, with cash, or with some of those tomatoes if they come in good." The simplicity of the transaction, rooted in community and trust, overwhelmed her. She simply nodded, unable to speak. By the afternoon, the rhythmic pounding of Eli's hammer mixed with the distant rumble of thunder. Kala brought him a cup of water, watching as he skillfully nailed a new sheet of corrugated tin over the rotten wood. The sound was not an intrusion. It was a song of repair, of making whole what had been broken. The first drops of rain began to fall just as Eli fastened the last nail. He gathered his tools as the sky opened up. Kala stood in the doorway of her cabin, and watched the rain sheet down, drumming a loud, percussive beat on the new tin roof. Not a single drop made it inside. The air in the small room smelled of damp earth and fresh wood. A clean, new smell layered over the ancient scent of the hearth. She sat on the floor, leaning against the wall, and listened to the storm. It was not a sound of morning like the wind in the chimney. This was a vigorous, drenching rain, a baptism. She thought of Brian's letter, still tucked in her bag. The guilt was still there, a dull ache, but it was no longer a commanding voice. It was just a part of her history, like the blisters that had become calluses. She had made her choice, and this roaring, rain-drenched solitude was the result. It was a difficult peace, but it was peace nonetheless. When the rain slowed to drizzle, she stepped outside. The world was washed clean, the colors of the grass and leaves intensely green. The red dirt lane had turned to a shallow stream of muddy water, and there, standing by the edge of the lane, was a figure she knew instantly, even through the misty haze. It was London. She stood holding a small suitcase, her clothes soaked, her face a mask of anger and confusion and relief. She had not driven. She must have taken a bus, and then walked the last few miles. Kala's heart stopped. She stood frozen in the doorway, the space between them feeling like a canyon she had dug with her own hands. London's voice cut through the quiet, sharp and brittle. You weren't missing. You were just gone. The work was not over. The past was not just the distant past. It was yesterday, and it was standing right in front of her, demanding to be reckoned with. Kala took a deep breath, smelling the rain and the wet pine, and stepped out into the damp world